From today, Savior Guild won't exist anymore.
I remember what it felt like. The spear entered just below my left shoulder blade and came out 6 inches in front of my chest. Cold metal. That specific wrongness. The sensation of something passing through a space that was not meant to be passed through. I had been in enough dungeons to know the difference between a wound and a death. This was a death. I did not fall immediately. I stood there for a moment, looking at the tip of the lance emerging from my own chest, and my first thought was not rage. It was recognition. I had known this feeling was coming. I just hadn't known it would come from Adrian. His hand was still on the shaft. I turned my head, slowly, because quick movements were no longer available to me, and looked at him. He looked back. His face was the same face I had trusted for 3 years. Calm, certain. The face of a man who had made his calculations and was satisfied with the result. "Thank you for your service," he said. "You helped me reach this highest level." I tried to answer. What came out was not words. Stella stepped forward from the shadows at the edge of the gate chamber. She had been standing there the whole time. I understood in that moment that she had always been standing there, in every plan, in every mission briefing, in every raid where I thought Adrian and I were making decisions together. She was the architecture. Adrian was the hand. She looked at me the way you look at a problem you have already solved. "You understand the situation," she said. It was not a question. When the dungeon clears, the powers remain. Every ability, every skill, every level. Adrian and I intend to use them. The world after the gate closes is a different calculation than the world inside it. Her voice was precise, unhurried. Without our current power and abilities, how would we control the world with an iron fist and enjoy our luxurious lifestyle anymore? You were the only variable that could not be managed. Behind her, I could see the bodies of the others. Daiwan, Cho Min, Park Ji-sung, everyone who had followed me to the final gate. Each of them had trusted me. I had led them here. There was a specific flavor to that knowledge. Not guilt exactly, but something heavier. The weight of being the reason people were dead. I had not noticed the hemotoxin seeping into my bloodstream until I felt my resistance drop. 90% reduction. Belong's curse working underneath the poison. A 2-key combination I recognized from theory, but had never expected to feel firsthand. Adrian was thorough. He had prepared this the way you prepare a chess ending. Every piece placed 3 moves before the capture. I tried to raise my arm. I could not raise my arm. "You were significant," Adrian said. There was almost something like respect in it. "That is why we needed to be certain." The gate light pulsed, once, steady white. I fell. Here is what I thought about while I was dying. I thought about Lee Byung-ho, who had been my partner for 8 months, before I noticed the way he watched Adrian a fraction of a second longer than necessary when Adrian gave orders. I had filed that away and done nothing with it. He was dead at the 40th floor. I thought about the recruiter who brought me to Messiah Guild, a quiet woman who told me Adrian was the only person she had ever met who she believed was genuinely good. She had said it plainly, without calculation, which meant she believed it. She had died at the 62nd floor of a dungeon I had cleared the week before without her. I thought about the fact that I had chosen to trust Adrian, not been deceived, not manipulated beyond my ability to resist. I had seen the warning signs, the way he always needed to know where I was, the specific questions he asked about my skills limits, and I had decided that the man who had pulled me out of a cave-in on the 31st floor could not also be the man who was cataloging my vulnerabilities. That choice was mine. The last thing I decided, as the gate light faded and the cold became something else, was that I would never make it again. Not because I was angry, because I now understood the exact cost of opening the door, and I had the numbers, and the numbers did not justify the risk. Then white. The noise came first. Engine, road vibration, the smell of canvas and fuel. 11 other bodies packed into the back of a military transport truck, uniformed soldiers who were either sleeping or pretending to sleep, and outside the canvas flaps, a sky that was the particular gray of very early morning. I opened my eyes and did not move. I knew exactly where I was. I knew exactly when I was. The first day. Before the dungeons opened publicly, before the guilds formed, before the mass panic. The day the system descended and everyone in the world got a notification they did not understand. This truck was en route to a highway clearing operation. In 40 minutes, we would encounter an orc horde blocking the road. In my previous life, I had survived that encounter by staying behind a soldier twice my size and swinging at anything that got past him. I looked at my hands in the gray light. Young, unscathed. Every scar I had earned over 3 years of dungeons was absent. I sat up. The system notification was already present, a translucent panel hanging at the edge of my vision. patient, waiting. I knew what it contained. I had seen the class selection menu once before, at this exact moment, and I had chosen Explorer because it was the first interesting thing on the list, and I was 22 years old and had not yet understood what I was choosing. I was not 22 years old anymore. I pulled the menu open and scrolled. The other soldiers were beginning to stir, some of them staring at their own panels with wide eyes, one of them making a sound like a person who has just stepped off a cliff. I ignored them. Explorer, Scout, Battle Mage, Warrior, Healer, Summoner, Illusionist. 43 classes on the primary list, the ones the system foregrounded, the ones most players would see and choose from. Useful, balanced, designed for someone who did not know what they were doing. I scrolled past all of them. At the bottom of the secondary list, past the advanced classes and the hybrid variants, past the ones flagged with warning icons that most first-day players never reached, was a single entry marked with the designation I recognized, Dark World Surrogate. The class description read, controls curses, poisons, and the undead. Scales with intelligence. Considered a villain class. Not recommended for cooperative play. I selected it in 3 seconds. The truck shuddered. Outside, the first sounds of the orc horde reached us through the canvas. Low guttural noise, the specific percussion of a mass of large bodies moving across pavement. The other soldiers were panicking now, reaching for weapons they were not trained to use in contexts like this. One of them was praying. I climbed out of the truck. The highway stretched ahead for half a kilometer, and at the far end of it, the orc horde filled the road shoulder to shoulder. Several hundred, armed with whatever they had carried through the gate that had opened in the hillside to the east. I looked at them for a moment. I knew exactly what the Dark World Surrogate could do on day 1. The answer was not much, but I also knew what it would do at level 50, at level 200, at the point where the skeleton army numbered in the thousands and the curses stacked 20 deep on a single target. I started walking toward the orcs. The soldiers behind me were shouting. Someone grabbed my arm. "What are you doing? We need to wait for—" "Stay behind me," I said. "Or don't. Either way." I let the hemotoxin skill run through my hand and into the first blade I summoned. Poison blood. The orcs in the front rank fell before they reached me. I was not fast. I was not elegant. Every kill was exactly as precise as necessary, and no more. By the time the last orc dropped, the soldiers behind me had not fired a single shot. They were standing in a half circle at a distance they had instinctively chosen, far enough from the danger, close enough to see. I looked at the bodies on the road. I looked at the notification telling me I was now level 2. I turned around and walked back to the truck. Phoenix Guild's registration office smelled like new carpet and cautious ambition. Victor's organization was not yet what it would become. On day 1 of the apocalypse, it was still a company trying to understand what kind of company it needed to be. The receptionist handed me forms. The guild manager, a thin man with the careful smile of someone whose job required him to have a careful smile, walked me through the membership contract. There were 3 supplementary fee clauses that were not standard. I signed them without commentary. Corruption is only bad if you are not the one involved in it, and I intended to be involved in it at every level before this was over. The entry assessment was straightforward. Combat efficiency, mana capacity, reaction time. I passed each at a level precise enough to be unremarkable. The examiner made a note that suggested mild disappointment. That was correct. That was the outcome I needed. "You have an unusual class selection," the manager said, reviewing my registration. Dark World Surrogate was visible on my profile. He frowned at it the way people frown at things they do not understand. "New player," I said. "Wrong scroll." He accepted this. People accept explanations that require them to do no further work. From the 5 skill cards the guild offered as a welcome bonus, I selected Hemotoxin without reading the others. I already knew what I needed. "Welcome to the guild," he said. I was nobody in Phoenix Guild. Entry rank, no history. The kind of member whose badge would not be remembered at the end of the week. I had made sure of that. I walked out into the street and stood for a moment in the early afternoon light. In my previous life, the Dark World Surrogate class had belonged to Marcus, the man they called the Immortal King, the world's strongest player, the one I had fought alongside 3 times in multi-guild raids and never once spoken to directly. He had built his power over years. Every piece of it was documented in my memory. Which dungeons, which skills, which decision points. I was not going to build what Marcus had built. I was going to build something Marcus never needed, because Marcus had never had to kill anyone specific. I had a list. The list had 2 names at the top, I did not say them out loud. I did not need to. I had been saying them silently since the moment the white light stopped and the gray morning began. I had died once already. I had died with every door open, every trust extended, every wall lowered in the direction of people who had been cataloging my vulnerabilities from the first handshake. That version of me was dead at the final gate. Good. He had served his purpose. He had taught me the exact lesson I needed at the exact cost it required. I started walking. The first skeleton was already forming in the corner of my peripheral vision, barely a frame of bone from the orc corpses on the highway, carrying a goblin-grade weapon, moving at roughly the speed of a cautious elderly person. It could defeat one enemy if that enemy was distracted and standing still. I was not discouraged. I knew exactly how this grew. I had always hated the smell of dungeons, wet stone, old copper, and the particular sweetness of monster blood that had been on the floor long enough to dry and crack. It was not a smell you got used to. You just got tired of complaining about it. I crouched over the third orc corpse and pressed 2 fingers to its sternum. A cold pulse moved through my hand, the conversion thread catching, locking, pulling. The body stiffened, then it stood up behind me, slower and shakier than the real thing. Its eyes 2 steady points of blue light in a face that had stopped being a face about 20 seconds ago. That made 11. I straightened and looked at them. They stood where I left them, still as furniture, waiting. 11 skeletons in a row. No ego, no opinions, no questions about the plan. After a previous lifetime of trusting people who smiled and agreed, and then sold me out for promotion, this was a profound improvement. I had been running 3 dungeons a week for 6 weeks. Solo entry with skeleton forward pressure, hemotoxin as the closer. The roster grew by 1 or 2 per run. Nobody was tracking the output because nobody was watching a rank D hunter farm orc corridors when the A rank guilds were contesting the Stone Fortress dungeons in the north. That was the point. In the previous timeline, I had been visible, signed with Phoenix, climbed in their records, put my real name, my real class, my real numbers on everything they asked me to sign. I had trusted the institutional process because I was 24 and I thought talent was a contract that other people would honor. It was not. This time, I was building in the dark. Let Phoenix have my name. They had a rank D hunter with a standard summoner class and a thin record. That was all they needed to see, and that was all they were going to see until I was ready to stop being invisible. The 11th skeleton shifted its weight. I could feel it at the edge of my awareness, the way you feel your own fingers. Not attention, exactly. More like peripheral certainty. They were mine, all of them. I turned and walked out. They followed, single file, silent. The dungeon did not say goodbye. It never did. The Eye of Anubis was not in the guild catalogs. Phoenix kept records on every skill item above rank C that had been confirmed in the Korean dungeon system. The Eye was not in those records because the only person who had ever found it, a solo hunter named Park, who dropped into the mid-tier Cobalt dungeon on a Tuesday 3 months into the first wave, had died in the same chamber before he could report it. I knew because I had read the dead man's memories in the previous timeline, which was a strange piece of information to carry, but useful. I lifted the disc off the pedestal. The inscriptions were warm under my hand in a way that stone should not have been. The notification appeared in the corner of my vision. System, neat and without ceremony. Skill acquired. Eye of Anubis, rank B. Activate upon recently deceased to retrieve residual memory fragments. Range, 3 days post-death. Duration of use, 1 minute per activation. Daily limit, 1 use. 1 use per day. That was the constraint that had mattered in the previous timeline and still mattered now. I had spent the entire final year wishing I had activated it on the right corpse at the right moment instead of wasting it on secondary targets. I was not going to make that mistake again. I had already identified the corpse I was saving it for. He was not dead yet. That was fine. I had time. I pocketed the disc and checked my skeleton count. 12. 1 had converted itself out of a guardian I had not bothered to mention. Efficient. I appreciated efficiency in tools. It was one of the things I was increasingly grateful to not require from people. Oscar's office smelled like instant coffee and professional discretion. He was shorter than I remembered. Compact, bald, the kind of man whose clothes were always slightly too conservative for the era, as if he had stopped updating them the moment they reached functional and saw no reason to change. He sat across from me with a folder on the desk between us that he had not opened yet and a paper cup he had filled from a kettle so old the brand had worn off. "You want coffee?" he said. It was not a question. It was an assessment of my financial leverage. "I want an identity," I said. He opened the folder. What followed was a transaction that took 18 minutes and cost more than my monthly food budget. I paid without negotiating. Oscar's eyes moved to my face when I did that. recalibrating. Most people argue the price down, he said. Most people don't know what they're buying. I slid the secondary documentation across the desk. The skill registration under Isaac Ivanov needs to be airtight. Any connection to the base identity collapses both of them. I know how aliases work, Oscar said. He did not say it defensively. He said it the way a carpenter says he knows how wood works. As a simple fact, slightly bored, not at all interested in explaining it. He reviewed the registration packet. His pen moved in 3 places. He stamped 2 sheets, set one aside, and slid the rest back to me. Isaac Ivanov, he said. Rank D, summoner adjacent, no guild affiliation. Born in Vladivostok, naturalized 6 years ago, currently operating as a freelance dungeon contractor. He paused. You want the residency documentation too, or just the hunter certification? Residency, guild application trail, and 2 years of dungeon completion records at the lower tiers. I thought for a moment. Make the completion records look slightly inconsistent. Competent, but patchy, like someone who farms occasionally when money is tight. Oscar made a small sound that was not quite amusement. That costs extra, he said. I know. He took the extra. We shook hands. He held my leverage the way professionals hold leverage, with both hands, quietly, understanding that a leverage holder who stays predictable is worth more to both parties than one who flinches. I left the office with Isaac Ivanov's documentation in my jacket pocket and Oscar's contact number in my memory. I had one more stop to make before the Skull Guild found out I existed. The A-rank orc dungeon was not the same as I remembered it. I had cleared it in the previous timeline at month 8. This was month 3, which should have meant lighter resistance, lower difficulty, easier mechanics. In most cases, that logic held. The dungeon system was supposed to scale with the challenger pool's average development. The orc champion hit like it was month 8. I got that information on my first attempt, from the ground, with a shoulder that was going to bruise impressively, and a skeleton soldier who had just been split vertically from collarbone to hip. The system registered the loss and began the conversion timer on what remained. Efficient, in the grim way that systems are efficient when they do not have feelings about the material. The champion stood in the center of the chamber with its necklace of carved bone beads swinging from the impact, looking at me the way things look at things they have already dismissed. I stood up. I had made a mistake. The timeline had drifted, small changes compounding over 6 weeks into a dungeon boss that had scaled faster than my projections. This happened. This was the part of working from memory that no amount of planning fully accounted for. The map was always slightly wrong because the map was from a world that no longer existed. I adjusted. The necklace was the power source. I had known that in the previous timeline, and the knowledge still applied. What I had not known was the output differential. The champion was channeling approximately 40% more force than I had anticipated. That was a materials problem, and materials problems had solutions. Second attempt, 12 skeletons through the door in a spread pattern. Hemotoxin discharged from the 3rd corridor junction. 3 seconds of distraction while I circled to the champion's left flank and reached the necklace with both hands. The beads broke, one by one, then all at once. The champion's swing went wide by 6 feet and hit the wall hard enough to crack the stone. It stumbled. My arrow caught it at the base of the throat, not the eye, which was more satisfying but less reliable, and the hemotoxin did the rest in about 40 seconds. I stood over the body and checked the drop notification. Skeleton limit increased to 15. Outside, through the dungeon entry, I could hear the other guild teams finishing off the horde. The sound of institutional effort, many people working hard on something that one person with foreknowledge had already decided. I pulled my arrow free and turned to count my losses. 3 skeletons gone, 9 standing. The math was still favorable. The Skull Guild scouts were watching from the upper balcony. I knew because I had been counting them since entry. 2 had disappeared while I was fighting, which meant they were reporting back, which meant the timeline had moved in exactly the direction I had planned for. I did not look up at the balcony. I did not need them to know that I had counted them. I needed them to think I was interesting. The Skull Guild had a rookie problem. Their screening process valued aggression over awareness, which meant their forward scouts were the kind of people who thought they were invisible because they had stopped looking at themselves. The one at the junction was watching the corridor ahead and not the ceiling. His 2 partners were watching him. I had been on the ceiling for 11 minutes. I dropped when the junior scout was looking the wrong direction. The conversion was clean. 1 motion, no announcement. The rookie's build was inconvenient but workable. About 2 inches shorter than me, broader shoulders, a skull guild patch on the left sleeve that I pulled loose and pocketed before the body finished settling. The two partners saw what they expected to see, their colleague coming back from the secondary passage. The Skull Guild Master was 4 levels down, in a chamber he had converted into a command post. His name was Hayato. In the previous timeline, I had never learned that. He had died in the dark with his secrets intact, and his network had spent years operating inside the Korean dungeon system because nobody had ever put a face to the organization. I walked down 4 levels in borrowed clothes. Hayato was not a large man. He had a careful, conservative quality to his movements, the kind of precision that came from years of operating in hostile environments where the wrong motion costs you. He looked at me when I entered. Something shifted behind his eyes, a recognition, or the beginning of one. I did not give it time to finish. The skeleton soldiers came through the 2 secondary entrances simultaneously. Hayato moved fast, faster than his build suggested, which meant the file on him was incomplete. He reached the panic button on the wall before I crossed the room, which should have been a problem. The button was connected to a relay I had identified on entry and severed while he was watching the wrong door. He understood then, not all of it, but enough. He did not speak. He made a calculation, the kind that takes about 3 seconds, and arrives at a conclusion you already knew was coming, but needed to verify. Then he reached into his jacket, not for a weapon, for a syringe. I watched him make the choice and did not move to stop it. In the previous timeline I had tried, the result was the same, faster, and I had a bruised wrist for a week. Hayato had very strong opinions about who was allowed to access his memories. He died holding his convictions, which I respected. In the abstract sense, you respect things that have stopped being your problem. I crouched beside the body and held the Eye of Anubis disc flat against his chest. The inscriptions warmed. 60 seconds. What I saw in 60 seconds was not comfortable. Hayato's memories had the texture of a man who had been doing this for a long time and considered it a career. The Yamato faction, a Japanese intelligence operation with resources I had previously estimated at mid-tier, was not mid-tier. They had 2 embedded agents inside Messiah Guild, the largest and best resourced hunter organization in Korea, the Swordmaster and the Archer Master, both presented as Korean nationals. Both had been operating under deep cover for years. They had given Adrian the authorization to move against me, not the idea, the authorization. The idea had been Adrian's. The distinction was important. I stood up. The 60 seconds had elapsed. The eye returned to latency, satisfied, doing its job. The Skull Guild's network was not just a criminal inconvenience. It was a perimeter fence around a much larger operation. Eliminating them now, 6 months in, before they absorbed the 3 smaller guilds they would spend the next year recruiting, removed 4 or 5 future problems at once. I set my skeletons to processing the document cache. Whatever Hayato had been running in paper form was going to Oscar by morning. My car was the ugliest vehicle in the lot, which was intentional. The logic was simple. People who are watching for you look for things worth looking at. A pale green 1950s saloon with rust along the wheel arches and a driver's side window that stuck halfway was not worth looking at. It was worth looking away from. I had spent 2 weeks finding the right one. Ugly, reliable, invisible. And I was satisfied with the investment every time someone's eyes slid off it in a parking lot. The silver-haired woman was leaning against my passenger door. She had been inside the dungeon. I had noticed her on level 3. Silver hair, combat practical clothes. The particular stillness of someone who has been in enough dangerous situations that they have stopped performing alertness and simply achieved it. She had died on level 4, killed by the Dungeon Guardian's secondary arc attack, clearly, definitively, with the kind of finality that usually ended discussions about the future. She was now leaning against my car, looking mildly inconvenienced. Level 2 food cache, she said. Did anyone find it? Left side, I said, behind the false wall near the second alcove. She made a face that indicated she had suspected as much and was annoyed at herself for not checking. I stopped a few feet from the door and looked at her. She looked back without any of the self-consciousness the situation warranted. You died, I said. I noticed, she said. It takes about 90 seconds. It is not painful after the first moment. The inconvenient part is people screaming and making a fuss. A pause. You did not scream. I counted. I know. I could see you from the respawn point. She pushed off the car and stood straight, not quite blocking the door, positioned so that leaving without talking to her was technically possible, but would have required a decision. My name is Leona. I have been watching your operation for 2 weeks. You do not waste motion. You do not advertise. You are playing a different game than everyone else in this city, and I find that interesting enough to ask about. I looked at her for a moment. Terms, I said. I specify them, Leona said, as if this were obvious. I am not a guild asset, and I am not a rescue. I come and go as the operation requires it. You do not ask me to stop dying. You do not ask me how it works. A slight pause. You may ask what I want in return. What do you want in return? Interesting problems, she said, and access to whatever food cache we find in future dungeons. The parking lot lights hummed. Somewhere behind us, the dungeon exit cycled and released a group of hunters who had nothing to do with either of us and were already forgetting this corner of the lot. I unlocked the car. She got in the passenger side without being invited, which was probably the most honest preview of the working relationship I was going to get. I started the engine. It made the sound it always made, a deep, embarrassed cough, then a grudging idle. The car, Leona said, looking at the dash. Don't. She did not. Adrian set the report on the table without reading the last page. 3 coordinated dungeon raids in the Southern District. No guild signature. The Skull Guild's entire leadership gone inside a 72-hour window, with nothing left behind that indicated who had done it or why. Stella had flagged the pattern at 9 in the morning, and he had been turning it over since. Whoever it is, Stella said, they are not working out of any registered guild, or they registered under a name we have not pulled yet. Adrian turned the report face down. Flag all rank D and C hunters who logged dungeon entries in the Southern District over the last 2 months. Cross-reference with anyone who dropped below expected completion rate, someone who is deliberately running below their ability. That is a wide filter. Tighten it on exit times and sequential entry patterns. He moved to the window. This is not opportunism. Someone planned this, knew Skull's internal structure, and executed it in a way that left no cooperating witnesses. That is either an experienced guild with very good discipline or one person who does not need help. Stella wrote something in her notebook. You think it is one person? Adrian looked at the city below him. I think it is worth finding out before they decide to be interesting in our direction, he said. He filed the anomaly under watch list and did not yet connect it to anyone he had known well enough to bury. The dungeon smelled like wet stone and old blood, the kind that had been there long enough to stop mattering. I counted 6 guild flags at the entrance, which meant roughly 400 players who had each independently decided I was the threat in the room. I found that flattering. I also found it incorrect. I had not come here to fight 400 people. I had come here to kill 1 snake, collect 1 pearl, and leave before anyone thought to check who Isaac actually was. The flags were planted in a semicircle at the dungeon mouth. Clean message. Guild law being what it was, none of them could touch me at an entrance without a formal challenge. They needed the paperwork, the witnesses, the process. So they were making a wall out of bodies and hoping Isaac Ivanov from Moscow would look at 400 people and decide the pearl was not worth it. I looked at 400 people. The pearl was worth it. Phoenix Guild was on the left flank. Their guild boss, Victor, stood 3 rows back from the line in the way guild bosses do when they want to look present without being first. Middle-aged, the kind of expensive that came from accumulated careful decisions rather than any single good year. He was watching the entrance with the expression of a man who had already counted the assets and believed the math was in his favor. The woman standing beside him was not watching the entrance. She was watching Stella. Stella was across the plaza, positioned near the Messiah Guild flag. She was talking to 2 of her people and not looking in this direction. But the Phoenix Guild woman, young, dark-haired, professional in the way of someone who did not make professional mistakes, had been watching Stella since we arrived, from the moment the Messiah liaison stepped into sight. The watching lasted 2 full seconds. Then it stopped. Her expression never changed. She filed it. I filed that she filed it. One of the captains in the blocking line said something loud about the terms of the coalition agreement. I did not listen. I was already counting the spacing between the 3 captains who would move first. I could see the gap between their left shoulders and the next row, not wide enough. Leona was standing slightly behind me, eating something she had found in her own pocket. She looked mildly interested in the situation, which for her counted as engaged. They are going to move, she said. Yes, you are not going to stop. No. She put the food away. I liked Moscow better. The 3 captains moved exactly when I expected. I raised one hand, not in surrender, in signal. 47 skeleton soldiers rose from the ground in a single wave between me and the blocking line. Not attacking, standing. The sound they made standing was enough. Bone on stone. The low rattle of 47 sets of joints settling into position simultaneously. The front row of guild hunters took one involuntary step back. Crowd physics. When the front row moves, the rows behind them compress in confusion and nobody decides anything for a full 3 seconds. 3 seconds was all I needed. I walked through the gap on the left, past the captain who had stepped back, past the second row, past the third. The skeleton soldiers held the line and then followed behind me like water closing after a stone. None of the 400 guild hunters moved to stop me. Legal constraints are useful things. I had read the guild charter's entry provision clause twice before arriving. No approved assault on a licensed hunter at a registered dungeon entrance without a formal challenge, and a 48-hour response window. 400 people, and not one of them wanted to be the first name on the paperwork. Leona walked through the gap after me. She glanced back at the crowd. "They are very loud for people who are not doing anything," she said. "That is usually what loud sounds like." I posted her at the entrance with one instruction: be present. She looked at the crowd. She looked at me. I am an immortal who has not eaten a proper meal in 3 days. Being present is the only thing I am reliably able to do. Then we are aligned. I went in. I went. The first floor was a survival zone, 5 days minimum, the dungeon's way of telling everyone who entered to earn the second floor. We had already run it. We were coming back in, past the timer, into the open path to the snake. Floor 2 opened like a throat. The stone here was different, darker, wet in places, with a low colorless mist that pooled in depressions and crept along the floor walls. Nothing living on floor 2 except the snake. The guilds had come in ahead of me. I could see their torchlight further up the corridor, hear the organized sounds of a large formation moving. 400 people in a snake hunting configuration takes up significant space and makes significant noise. I moved along the wall, quiet, with my skeleton soldiers spread in a line behind me. The boss room was a hemisphere. Stone walls curved upward and met in a rough dome 40 feet overhead. The snake occupied most of it. The needle snake was not a subtle creature. Length of 30 feet, maybe more, coiled at rest, which meant it was also fast. The body was pale, almost translucent, with a faint iridescent sheen where the scales caught the dungeon light. Most players who had seen it died immediately after. I had read their death reports in the dungeon registry before we entered. Every single one noted the same thing. Attacked, the thorns hit, and then the party started dropping to poison with no visible source. Confusion phase, retreat phase, death phase. I read those reports and understood the mechanism immediately. The guilds did not. They were still in the attack phase when I reached the observation ridge above the boss room. The snake ejected thorns from its body in clusters. Defensive response to physical contact. The way a porcupine fires quills. The thorns hit armor, hit skin, and the parties retreated to heal. Standard dungeon logic. Survive the attack, heal, re-engage. Except nobody made it to re-engage. They kept dropping. The thorns open pores. The pores emit the miasma. The miasma is colorless and odorless, and 20 feet wide around the snake at any given moment. Every time a party pressed into attack range, they breathed it in. Every time they pulled back to heal, they thought the pores had closed. They had not closed. The emission radius just shrank with distance. The poison was already in them. The front line of the Anyungjun Alliance collapsed in sequence. 5, then 8, then a cascade. The survivors pulled back to the entrance of the boss room, shouting, reorganization. A captain's voice carrying above the chaos. Hold your positions. We rotate the next wave. I had been watching from above. I had my answer. My skeleton soldiers were immune to poison miasma. They had no lungs. They had no biology. The dungeon's design had not accounted for that. I gave the signal. 47 soldiers down the slope in silence. No battle cry. No sound except the rattle of bone on stone and the low creak of joints built from nothing. The snake turned toward them the way a predator turns toward prey, which meant it turned away from me. That was the arrangement. I moved along the wall at floor level, fast, keeping inside the mist zone on purpose. Power of Apashish. Total immunity to all poisons. I had been running the dungeon's first floor for 5 days specifically to acquire that skill from a hidden egg I had located before we ever entered. Not lucky, planned. The snake fired thorns at the first rank of skeleton soldiers. Pores opened. Miasma hit them and did nothing because there was nothing to hit. They held their range. The snake fired again, harder, driving them back 2 steps. Then the pores opened for the second volley. I was there. Blood toxin through the open pore, injected at contact range. The snake's skin was the thickest at the scales and nearly non-existent at the pore edge, a structural compromise the dungeon designers had built into the boss because something had to give. It gave there. The toxin spreads at a rate the snake cannot expel. Every new thorn volley opened more pores. Every open pore was another injection. I moved in the mist that could not touch me, following the pattern of the snake's defensive fire, hitting each opening as it appeared. The snake figured out what was happening on the 8th injection. It coiled tight, closed its posture, stopped firing thorns. Smart animal. No thorns meant no open pores. I waited. The skeleton soldiers held. They do not get impatient. They do not need to breathe. They simply stand in the mist and wait in the exact positions they were given. The snake had to move eventually. It was not a patient creature by design. It was a predator in a closed room with 47 irritants. On the 4th minute, it uncoiled and fired a full-body volley, the kind that had killed every previous hunting party in one wave, thorns in every direction, every pore open at once. I had been standing still for 4 minutes, inside the mist, watching. I moved through the volley along the snake's left side, hitting every pore I passed, fast, 1 injection per pore, not stopping. The toxin was already at critical spread from the first 8 injections. This tipped it past the threshold. The snake's stats collapsed by half in the space of 20 seconds. It started moving toward the room's north wall, escape instinct, or a dungeon mechanic designed to prevent complete cornering. I had already placed Leona's corpse explosions in all 4 directions before the fight started. She had not been thrilled about the setup. She had done it anyway. North wall, explosion. East passage, explosion. South gap, explosion. The snake tried the west wall. I was standing there with one hand raised. The last explosion took the room and everything in it. Stone dust, the low creak of settling. I stood in the mist that could not touch me. 30 seconds of quiet. My skeleton soldiers were still standing at the positions I had given them. I walked to the snake's body. The magic pearl was in the 3rd segment from the head. I had read the anatomy notes in the hunter registry. Round, about the size of a closed fist. Warm in a way that dungeon stone was not. I took it out and put it in my inventory. 4 minutes and 50 seconds. Fastest first kill in the dungeon's recorded history. The achievement notification appeared and then vanished because I had my system display on minimal. From outside the boss room, I could hear the Anyang-Jun Alliance regrouping. One of them had apparently been watching from the corridor above. I could hear the summary being passed back, voices rising in frustration. The bones were immune. Yes, that was correct, but that was only half the answer, and the half that did not explain anything useful. I walked back toward the entrance. The Anyang-Jun Alliance was still arguing about the skeleton immunity question when I passed through the boss room exit and back up through floor 1. Some of them tried to get between me and the dungeon exit. Leona and 3 skeleton soldiers had not moved from the entrance. The Alliance hunters who had already come out ahead of me took one look at the immortal woman with 3 skeleton soldiers standing at her back and decided the loot question was somebody else's problem. I exited the dungeon. 400 guild hunters were still present in the plaza. Most of them had been standing there for what was now close to 6 hours. The ones who had gone into the dungeon were coming out behind me in clusters, some of them injured, none of them looking in my direction. Leona fell in beside me. You were gone for a while. I was waiting for the snake. I was waiting for you. She reached into her pocket and found nothing. I am very hungry. Oscar said he would have food at the vehicle. What vehicle? The diplomatic car. She glanced at me. Her expression shifted by a small measurable amount, which for Leona meant genuine interest. He actually rented a diplomatic car. He suggested one. I told him not to bother. I kept walking. He borrowed one anyway. The plaza had gone quiet, not silent. There was shuffling, the low murmur of people recalculating. But the organized noise of a deterrence coalition, the confident volume of 400 people presenting a united front, was gone. Nobody was presenting anything. They were watching me walk across the stone with one hand in my jacket pocket and the other at my side, and none of them were sure what the next correct move was. I walked to Victor. He was where I had left him, 3 rows from the front, with the Phoenix Guild unit arranged behind him. The dark-haired woman at his side, his secretary, his second, something in that register, was watching me approach with a stillness that was different from the stillness of the rest of the plaza. The rest of them were frozen by uncertainty. She was still because she was already working. I stopped in front of Victor and gave the standard Phoenix Guild field report. Dungeon cleared. Single party run. Primary objective achieved. No unit casualties. Exactly the format his guild used. I had memorized it before the run. Victor looked at me for a moment. He was the kind of man who had built his organization on accurately assessing assets and their limits. He was doing that now, reassessing. He said, "Isaac." "Sir." That was the whole exchange. He gave a single nod, the kind that closes a subject. I returned the nod and turned away. Behind me, the coalition was already dissolving. No announcement, no formal dispersal. Just groups of hunters remembering they had other things to do, peeling away from the plaza in 1s and 2s, the semicircle of guild flags suddenly looking like an arrangement nobody could remember the purpose of. I did not look back. Stella had left before I exited the dungeon. I noticed her absence the same way I noticed her presence. She was part of the calculation, and her early departure told me exactly what it was supposed to tell me. Messiah Guild had been here to observe, not to prevent. Someone had already received a report. The filter was running. The name on the paperwork still said Isaac Ivanov. but the description attached to it was getting sharper every time. Oscar's car was waiting outside the plaza perimeter. It was not a diplomatic car. It was a mid-range black sedan with a small dent in the rear passenger door and a driver who had been paid to look official. Oscar had made one upgrade: a paper bag from a restaurant on the passenger seat with a receipt stapled to the outside. Leona opened the car door and looked at the paper bag. "That is food," she said. "That is payment for services rendered." She got in. I got in on the other side. The driver pulled out, and we were gone before the last guild flag came down. The pearl was in my inventory. The snake was dead. 400 people had been present for the end of the fiction that a coalition could hold a line against one man and 47 bones. I looked out the window at the city going past. Victor knew. He could not say it out loud. Isaac Ivanov was still technically his contracted asset, still technically the person who had just executed a clean field operation in Phoenix Guild's name, still technically within the bounds of professional relationship. But he knew what he had seen. The math had changed, and he was smart enough to know it had changed against him. In the front seat, the driver kept his eyes forward and did not ask anything. Leona ate the food and said nothing for 12 blocks, which was the longest she had gone without speaking since I met her. Then, the snake's thorns. You planned for those. Before we entered, yes. You spent 5 days on the first floor because of a hidden egg. The skill from the egg, yes. She looked out her window. The city moved past. You are going to be a significant problem for a great many people, she said. I find that mildly interesting. I know. I want better food next time. Noted. The rule about intelligence operatives is that they are useful precisely because nobody looks at them. Yang Ji was not a combatant. He was not on any threat registry. His hunter license listed him as a B-rank support specialist with the Knights of the Round Table, a legitimate independent team. Decent track record, no incidents. Nothing about him invited a second look. I had been looking at him for 3 weeks. In my previous life, he had burned 3 of my early staging locations. Not by attacking them, by watching them, recording what he saw, and passing the information in fragments to a handler whose name I had not learned until much later. 2 of my allies from those early months, people who had helped me without knowing what they were helping, died because their location became known through a trail that started with Yang Ji and ended with a quiet word from the Messiah Guild in the right direction. I never confirmed it then. I confirmed it now, the way I confirmed everything now, by working backward from what I already knew. He held his communication device differently when transmitting. Most people use 2 hands or set it flat. Yang Ji held it against his left palm and curled 2 fingers over the edge when sending, a grip that left the transmit window visible from the chest angle while looking forward. Trained field habit. The kind of thing you build over years until it is in the muscle and you do not know it is there. He had no idea he did it. I had no idea it was the tell until I watched him do it 4 times in 4 different locations across 2 weeks. And the only common denominator was the moment right after he made contact with someone I could never trace. I set the dungeon up on a Thursday morning. D-rank designation. The Hollow Caverns, a mid-tier dungeon with a modest reputation for skeleton-type enemies and 1 ambush room on the 3rd floor that the walkthrough guides warned about. Yang Ji's team ran it twice a month as a rotation fixture. I entered an hour before them with a fake ID under Oscar's maintenance license. Not the first time. The skeleton army was already in position by the time Yang Ji's team hit the 2nd floor. 6 soldiers positioned along the wall in a formation that matched his team's number. Not an attack formation, a blocking formation. I wanted him isolated, not dead in a hallway with witnesses. He was sharp, I will give him that. He noticed the displacement wrong, started moving backward instead of forward, tried to buy room. The sun's blessing activated on the first contact. Gawain's necklace, a legendary artifact that shields the bearer from lethal damage for a duration I had memorized years ago because the duration mattered. A fixed window, not negotiable, not extendable. I waited. Yang Ji understood near the end of that window that someone had planned specifically for the necklace. His expression went through a small sequence. Confusion first, then the calculation, then the version of recognition that is really fear processed into professional assessment. He said something about the fighting style, something about it reminding him of another name. The necklace expired. I did not let the moment be anything. It was an item on a list, and the item was now complete. I used the Eye of Anubis before I left him. The skill requires physical contact and a recently dead subject. The window closes fast, and so do the memories. The vision it produced was brief. A meeting room, a voice giving a direction, and 1 face that I already knew. I filed it. I had known this was coming. I had set aside a specific corpse for the full reading. This was not the corpse. This was the confirmation that the method worked, the preview, the single frame that told me the real existed. I left the dungeon through the service exit. Leona was leaning against the wall outside with the expression she wore when she had been waiting longer than she had agreed to, and the extra time had reduced her buffet margin. 40 minutes, she said. 42, I said. The necklace. You could have used a different method. A different method would have left questions. This one left an accident report. She considered this. She did not say I was wrong. She also did not say she was satisfied with the arrangement, which was its own answer. We left. The team's survivor report, filed the next morning, described a dungeon anomaly on the 3rd floor and a combat engagement that separated Yang Ji from the party. It was accurate. It did not mention me because the team did not know I had been there. Oscar, when I told him, crossed a name off a list I had never seen but could infer. 3 months, he said, give or take. He made a small sound that meant he agreed with the estimate. Then he folded his hands on the desk and said nothing else, which was the most efficient form of acknowledgement he knew. 3 months was what it cost Adrian in regional intelligence. Not nothing, not crippling, just a gap in the data stream that would require rebuilding, and rebuilding takes time that can be filled with other things. Oscar found the name on a Thursday, 2 weeks after Yang Ji. He did not deliver it dramatically. He said there was a connection worth examining between the spy network structure from the Skull Guild thread and a Messiah Guild handler operating across international dungeon territories. He said the connection was confirmed at 2 points in the network and speculated at a third. He said the man's name was Suzuki Ichi. I said I knew. Oscar paused. From before. Yes. How precise is your information? He fed Adrian my movement patterns for 8 months. In my previous life, the damage came later. I never identified him as the source until the sequence was already in motion. I did not know his face then. I know it now. Oscar wrote nothing. He rarely wrote things in meetings. He processed them and acted on them later, alone, in ways I did not track. He is currently in Kaisong. Kaisong was a lawless dungeon city. No guild law, no association oversight, no incident reports filed. The kind of place where a man like Suzuki Ichi operated comfortably because the absence of law was its own form of cover. I went as Isaac. Tanned skin, glasses, the Grim Reaper's mask over my face, the same setup that had walked out of the Needle Dungeon and into every major guild's incident report. Kaisong was the kind of city where a masked foreigner drew less attention than a recognizable face, which was the point. Suzuki was there on a recruitment mission. I spotted him near the registration block, lean, economical in movement, the walk of someone who had trained himself to take up exactly as much space as necessary and no more. He wore the Ring of Lancelot on the middle finger of his right hand, and I had been hoping he would not. The Ring of Lancelot grants immunity to all negative effects. Hemotoxin, blood poison, every status ailment in the standard necromancer toolkit. He had it because he was the kind of professional who anticipated the standard toolkit and prepared specifically for it. We entered the same dungeon within 20 minutes of each other. Not an accident on my part, not expected on his. The fight did not go well for him, but it did not go simply for me either. He killed his own poisoned team member in the first 60 seconds. A decision made cleanly, without hesitation, to remove a liability that would have distracted him. That told me the level of professional I was dealing with. He was not going to be overcome by sentiment or surprise. He was going to adapt until he ran out of room to adapt. He ran out of room. The ring protected him from poisons. It did not protect him from direct blood contact in a different application. The vampiric drain is not a status effect. It is a physical transfer, and the ring's immunity threshold does not distinguish between them. I learned this in a dungeon encounter in my previous life that I survived mainly because I had not been the target at the time. The detail stayed with me. Details like that stay. I turned him into a mummy. Then I collected his communication devices. The devices were encrypted, partially. The fragments I could access pointed toward a higher authority. Not Adrian's voice, not Adrian's authorization, but something above him. The shape of a permission, not a name. The implication that when Adrian had given the kill order for me, he had not given it on his own authority. I noted that. I filed it behind the Eye of Anubis, which I had been saving for exactly this moment. I knelt beside him. The skill requires intent and contact. You touch the subject, you state the function, and the vision comes in whatever form the dead mind held the memory. For most hunters, most corpses, the result is fragmented, sensory impressions, emotional residue, images that do not cohere into narrative. For someone whose most significant recent memory is a meeting in a room with another person's face and another person's voice giving a specific instruction, the result is different. It came through clearly. A meeting room, clean lines, mid-grade corporate aesthetics. Not lavish, not austere, the kind of room that exists to be forgotten. The lighting was even and artificial. There was a table, there were chairs, and there was Adrian. I had not seen his face in 3 years of this life. I had seen it every night for the years before that. In the specific way you see something that was the last thing you expected, that arrived from a direction you had left unguarded because you had trusted the person standing there. He looked the same. That was the first thing. He looked exactly the same as the man who had stood over me in the original timeline, with an expression of what I had read then as regret, but now understood as the mild inconvenience of a conclusion. Same light brown hair, well kept. Same gray-green eyes, clear and composed and intelligent. The kind of face that was made to be trusted because it genuinely did not look like a face that was deceiving you. It looked like a face that was managing a difficult situation responsibly. It looked like a face that took no pleasure in necessary decisions. He was speaking. The voice in the memory was calm, not hushed, not hurried. The voice of someone who had already made the decision before the meeting began and was now explaining the reasoning as a courtesy. He said my name, not Isaac Ivanov, my real name, the one I had carried for 29 years. And he said it the way you say a variable in an equation you have already solved. He said that I had become a variable they could no longer absorb. He said it plainly, the way you say a window is cracked and needs to be replaced. Not a moral question, a maintenance question. He was pleased with the plan. Stella stood to his right. She nodded once. Not agreement exactly, the nod of someone confirming that an assessment they already made has been acknowledged by the person with authority to act on it. The meeting ended with the quiet procedural efficiency of people who have done this kind of thing before. No raised voices, no ceremony, just the close of a session, chairs moving back from the table, the sounds of people leaving a room. And then Adrian looked across the room towards someone at the edge of the memory. The figure was there, present in the frame, close enough to have been part of the conversation, far enough to be at the margin of what Suzuki Ichi's memory held with clarity. A face, not a name, not a title, just the fact of a presence that Adrian deferred to in the direction of his attention, a micro movement of regard that the body makes without deciding to. I did not recognize the face. I noted it. The vision ended. The meeting room dissolved. I was in Kaisong, kneeling on dungeon stone, with my hand on a mummy and the smell of a fight still in the air around me. I already knew all of it, everything Adrian had said, the logic of the decision, the calm of the room, the efficiency of the process. I had built the last 3 years of my life around the knowledge that this had happened. Seeing it was different. That was the thing I had not prepared for, not the content, the reality of it, the specific weight of a thing you have carried as memory suddenly existing as evidence, not in your own mind, not in a version you reconstructed from grief and inference, but in a dead man's record, retrieved by a skill that does not editorialize. I stood up. I collected the communication devices. I checked the exits. I left. The third figure's face was filed in the part of my mind I keep for things that do not have a name yet. The walk back to the transit point took 11 minutes. In those 11 minutes, 3 things happened that I noted without stopping. First, Leona, who had been running a parallel operation in Kaisong for Oscar, some fragment of a mission that required her to hold a dungeon boss stationary for a specific window, had done so. She mentioned it when I found her at the transit point. She had held the boss for 6 seconds past the agreed window. The mission succeeded. She was owed an unlimited buffet. She mentioned that I had previously promised an unlimited buffet and had delivered one that was technically unlimited, but had closed its dessert service at a time that constituted bad faith. I said I would pass the feedback to Oscar. She said she would handle Oscar herself. Second, on the transport back, Oscar sent a brief message through the encrypted relay. Marcus, the hunter with the class advantage I had been tracking since the beginning, had joined the Messiah Guild. The timing connected directly to Suzuki Ichi's death. Suzuki had been the handler who, in the original timeline, had managed the early recruitment of Marcus for a different guild faction. With Suzuki gone 3 months earlier than the original sequence, the recruitment web had reoriented, and Marcus had landed somewhere else, somewhere closer to Adrian than he had been before. I had changed the timeline. Marcus was now inside the problem in a new configuration. I added it to the list of deviations I would need to account for. Third, Julia. I would not have clocked it, except that I had learned to watch her the way I watched anyone whose surface composure was doing more work than the situation required. She had a photograph on her desk, personal, framed. the kind that lives in a workspace because the person put it there deliberately and has looked at it often enough to stop seeing it consciously. When I passed her office on the way to the briefing room, she was holding it, not looking at it, holding it face down against the desk with one hand, the way you hold something you have decided to put away but have not put away yet. She looked up when she heard me in the corridor, composed in 2 seconds, less. The transition was fast and practiced and completely invisible to anyone who did not know what they were watching for. I knew what I was watching for. I did not ask. I filed it and kept walking. The losses arrived in a pattern that Adrian could not attribute to coincidence. Young-ji, clean. Suzuki Ichi, clean. 2 nodes in the Japanese network, both without witnesses, both in locations that required specific knowledge of the org chart to identify. He turned the pattern over twice, which was once more than he usually needed, and then he looked at Stella across the desk and said, "Expand the Isaac Ivanov file. I want everything." Stella said, "Everything we have is already in it." "Then find what is not in it yet," he said. "Someone with knowledge of our structure is doing this methodically. I want to know who Isaac Ivanov was before he was Isaac Ivanov." He did not say he was concerned. He was not concerned. He was interested in the way a chess player is interested when the other side opens in a way they have not seen before. Oscar had a name for me before I even landed in Taipei. Sam Oliver, Frontier Guild's regional captain for Taiwan. The man Adrian had assigned to keep a lid on the dungeon gate contracts there. The man who had also, according to Oscar's notes, received a direct order to eliminate me inside a survival dungeon before I could establish a foothold. I read the briefing on the flight over. Oscar had sent it in a plain text file attached to an expense report for 2,000 kilometers of coach airfare and 1 instant coffee thermos, itemized separately. He had written a note at the bottom. Thermos was personal equipment, therefore billable. I did not argue. He had earned it. The survival dungeon was Sam's pick, a Type 3 enclosed environment, high monster density, natural bottlenecks throughout, good ambush geography. He had run it before, knew where the choke points were, had positioned his 4-man team along the routes the dungeon naturally pushed people toward. Standard elimination setup. He expected a nervous newcomer who had gotten lucky a few times and did not know the difference between a real fight and a clean one. He did not know I had his team's position from the moment I cleared the entrance corridor. I sent the Wolf-class skeleton around the left wall while I moved right. It was faster than any human sprinter at full extension, low to the ground, silent in a way that large things should not be able to manage. Sam's team heard me. I made sure they heard me and rotated toward my direction. Sam himself moved forward to cut off my exit. He had Perkel's spear in hand, legendary tier, the kind of weapon that adds 30% to your physical statistics just by holding it and makes every wound it creates resist natural healing. He was comfortable with it. He had used it long enough that he moved like it was part of him. The wolf was already behind him when he raised the spear. Clean, no drama. Exactly what Sam Oliver was not expecting from a nervous newcomer who had gotten lucky. I stood over the spear for a moment after. It had a weight to it that legendary items get, not physical weight, something else, like the weapon knew it had been somewhere important before and was deciding whether it approved of the transfer. I picked it up. It approved. Oscar called before I had finished clearing the rest of Sam's team. "Taiwan gate contracts," he said, before I could speak. 3 of them. Sam Oliver was the administrative anchor. With him gone, they are floating. You have approximately 72 hours before Frontier Guild sends a replacement. 72 hours, I said. I am being generous. They may move faster if they realize the communication gap. I told him to start making calls. He told me the cheapest car rental in Taipei cost 40% more than Seoul. He sounded personally offended. I told him to expense it. He hung up. I looked at Sam Oliver's face one more time, with the eye of Anubis open. The memory lasted 30 seconds. Adrian had given the Taiwan assignment personally. Sam had understood it as a dual commission: manage the contracts, remove the obstacle, keep the territory clean. He had been thorough, careful, and completely wrong about the kind of obstacle he was dealing with. I closed the eye. Some memories were useful, some were just confirmation. I took Perkal's spear and left the dungeon. The brawler of the frozen forest had survived 23 attempts. That was the number that kept circulating in the dungeon briefings I intercepted from 3 different guild teams already in country. 23 teams had gone in and come out reduced. Some of them had not come out at all. The dungeon had a way of adapting, absorbing the power left behind equipment by failed attempts and folding it into the boss. 23 failed raids meant the boss inside was running at a cumulative strength well above its baseline spawn. I thought that was useful information. I entered as Isaac Ivanov. The Frozen Forest dungeon was a standard B-rank gate, medium scale, the kind of thing 3 mid-tier guilds could handle on a good day if they ran it smart. The Chinese Kunlun Guild was already working the outer sectors when I arrived, and I let my skeleton soldiers fan out in passive survey mode, not attacking, just present enough to register as a serious force. The Kunlun team lead tracked them for 2 minutes, and then started moving in a different direction. Reasonable. The Van Gogh bracelet was in the final sector. 3 different guild teams knew it. None of them had gotten close enough to matter yet. I had read enough about this dungeon's layout in my past life to know the bracelet was not what it appeared. Not just a legendary accessory item, but a structural piece of a larger equipment loadout that would matter in ways the Taiwan teams had not figured out yet. 5 rings on one hand simultaneously. The rings could not come off afterward. That was the trade-off. Most players heard that trade-off and walked away. I did not walk away from trade-offs. I inventoried them. Leona was at the dungeon entrance when I came back out to the transition corridor. She had Perkel's spear across her shoulders, the way people carry things when they are about to use them, rather than when they are being careful. "The ogre," she said. "Sector 9. It knows we are here." She considered this for a moment. Then, "I want to ride the large one." She meant the giant skeleton soldier. One of 2 I had constructed from the larger dungeon creatures earlier in the run. 7 feet tall, reinforced bone mass. Enough structural integrity to serve as a platform in sustained movement. I said yes. What happened in Sector 9 was not subtle. Leona rode the giant skeleton at full sprint into the ogre's forward guard, Perkel's spear leveled, and the ogre, which had survived 23 previous attempts by being patient and absorbing punishment and waiting for fighters to exhaust themselves, did not have a protocol for a woman on a skeleton horse, moving at that velocity with a legendary weapon in her hand. The first 3 wounds went in before it could reset its stance. She made 10 total before it began to withdraw. The blood toxin I had administered to the spear tip before we entered did the rest. I watched the ogre's health bar drain with the methodical satisfaction of a calculation resolving correctly. The Van Gogh bracelet dropped from the center of the boss room floor. I equipped it before we left the dungeon. 5 rings. The warmth of each one was faintly distinct, layered capability settling into sequence. I flexed my hand once, closed it, and filed the sensation under tools I now had available. On the way out of the dungeon, I became aware of a signature I had not been tracking. Adjacent dungeon territory in Taiwan ran in clusters. Several gates in geographic proximity shared a background mana current that a skilled reader could detect across the boundary. I had not been actively monitoring it. I was now. The signature from the adjacent cluster was unmistakable in the way that very specific things are unmistakable once you have encountered them before. Bone constructs, death class energy, the structured presence of a skeleton army in full operational deployment. Someone else was running the same class I carried. I stood at the boundary for a moment without moving. Leona noticed and did not ask. Across the ambient current, the signature paused. It had noticed me, Marcus. I did not know it was him yet, not by name, not with certainty, but I knew the Immortal King's former class signature the way you know a voice you last heard years ago in a different context. He had held this class before his ascension to whatever he was now. The Dark World surrogate had a taste to it, a specific resonance. He would have felt mine the same way. We stood on either side of the mana boundary for approximately 4 seconds. Then, the signature in the adjacent dungeon continued its work without crossing. I filed that too. Hostile, watchful, not yet moving. I did not know the timeline on when that changed, but I knew it would. I told Leona to book the next flight to the United States. The Dead Forest dungeon in America had been sitting dormant for 11 months because the American guilds could not agree on who was allowed to profit from it. 3 guilds had partial claim. 1 guild had a blocking veto, and the Frontier Guild had been quietly selling logistical support to all 4 sides simultaneously. By the time I arrived, the whole situation had the specific texture of a deal that had been negotiating itself into irrelevance for so long that everyone involved had forgotten the dungeon was what they were arguing about. I had Francis Chero's attention from the moment I registered for the run. I did not know that yet. I found out after. Ellis ran the American Guild team inside. Hard woman, efficient, carrying 2 pieces of the legendary King Arthur set, Arthur's ring and Merlin's staff, both in active use, both integrated into her operational style in ways that took years to build. She had earned those items. She knew it. Her team knew it. The problem was that she had also made a quiet arrangement with Frontier Guild's Jay Jackson to ensure Isaac Ivanov did not complete the run cleanly, even if he survived the dungeon. I knew about Jay Jackson. Oscar had told me on the plane. I had come prepared for a dungeon fight and a political fight simultaneously. The contribution system in the Dead Forest worked on kills. The guild with the most kills at the end of the run received the first priority on the Dragon Slayer title registration. Standard competitive raid design. What the system did not account for was the power of Pharaoh, a skill that converted kills made by other players in proximity into skeleton soldiers under my command, rather than counting as their contribution. Every creature Ellis's team killed in the forward sectors became mine. Her leaderboard numbers stayed flat. Mine climbed. She noticed after the 3rd sector. Jay Jackson's ambush came in Sector 6. 4 Frontier Guild operatives appearing from a secondary corridor they had bribed their way into from the dungeon administration. I used corpse explosions. 2 of the operatives did not get up. The other 2 reassessed their situation and withdrew. Jay Jackson filed a formal complaint on the guild communication channel 3 minutes later. I did not respond to it. Ellis confronted me in Sector 8 with her team arranged behind her. Arthur's ring glowing on her hand, Merlin's staff in active channel state. Her opening argument was that I had systematically stolen her team's contribution score through an exploit that should have been flagged by the dungeon administrators. I agreed with her assessment. The exploit was real. The administrators had not flagged it. These were both true statements. I offered her an alternative framing. Her team was carrying 2 pieces of a legendary set that, combined with a specific aura configuration I had access to, would generate sufficient heat output to defeat the Dullahan boss in the final sector. Without that combination, the boss was a sustained attrition fight that would take her team at minimum 4 hours and result in 2 to 3 casualties. With the combination, it was a single engagement under 10 minutes. The Dullahan ran cold, a permanent ice aura that neutralized most damage sources below a heat threshold the creature had specifically calibrated against its most common attackers. Most guilds lost people testing the threshold before they found a method that worked. I knew what worked. I knew from a past life, from a run I had watched someone else attempt and fail. Ellis looked at the ring on her hand for 3 seconds. Then she looked at me. "You already calculated this before you walked into my dungeon," she said. "Yes. And if I say no?" I told her about the player death reports from sectors 3 and 4. 12 recorded kills, 14 if you counted the ambush. The Frontier Guild's Jay Jackson had introduced unauthorized combatants into a registered dungeon run. That was a violation with specific administrative consequences. Consequences that would fall on the most recent party to file an obstructionist complaint, which was currently Ellis's guild, unless she had a clear reason to be positioned on the other side of the paperwork. She handed over the ring and the staff. Sector 10, the Dullahan boss. It moved like cold itself, a mounted figure, headless, trailing an ice field that dropped ambient temperature 15 degrees in every direction it traveled. The skeleton army hit the ice field and slowed. Expected. I had the aura field running through all 15 soldiers. The sun blessing from the Gale necklace, combined with the heat channel from both King Arthur items, distributed through the skeleton network as a shared thermal output. The combined effect was not elegant. It was sufficient. I killed the Dullahan directly. No skeleton intermediary for the final strike. I had made a choice to make that legible. I did not know why yet, only that it felt correct to do it personally. The Dragon Slayer title registered to Isaac Ivanov 30 seconds after the boss room cleared. Francis Chero was waiting outside the dungeon entrance. Tall man, mid-30s, the kind of bearing that comes from having been tested at genuine cost, and knowing the result of that test. He had the previous Dragon Slayer title. He had cleared a different Dragon-class dungeon in parallel, somewhere in Europe, the week before. He had flown in specifically to observe the Dead Forest run. He had not announced himself. He had watched through the dungeon boundary sensors that were technically only available to dungeon administrators. He looked at me for a moment without speaking. Then, "You made the final kill yourself. The skeleton army could have done it." Yes. Why? I considered the honest answer. Because it mattered that someone saw it done directly. He nodded once, slowly, as if I had confirmed something he had already suspected, but needed to hear stated. I am recommending you for the Japan A-rank Dragon Hatchling Dungeon, he said. It opens in 3 weeks. It requires a Dragon Slayer title holder. You now qualify. The team needs one more anchor class. He extended his hand. I shook it. There were very few moments in this second run when something felt like respect moving in both directions simultaneously. I filed the sensation carefully, not because it was comfortable, but because it was real. The notification came from Oscar 2 days after I was back in Seoul. The Dead Forest result had been registered and published in the International Dungeon Guild database. Isaac Ivanov, Dragon Slayer title, Taiwan and America operations confirmed. Oscar sent it with a note. Visibility is increasing. Recommend alias rotation planning within 90 days. I was reading the note when the second message came. Formal guild complaint, routed through the Korea Dungeon Authority's administrative channel. The Swordmaster, full name and title listed, Messiah Guild Senior Officer, filed a notice of territorial dispute against Isaac Ivanov. The Dead Forest Dragon Slayer territory registration had overlapped with a prior registration the Swordmaster had submitted and held since before Sam Oliver's removal. The dispute was administrative. The vow attached to it was personal. The Swordmaster's representative had submitted a recorded statement. Isaac Ivanov had taken what was not his, killed those under the Swordmaster's protection, and would be made to account for it. The statement was worded carefully enough to avoid constituting a legal threat while being entirely clear about what it meant. Leona read it over my shoulder. Do you want me to add it to the list? Yes, she made a note. I set the complaint down. Oscar called while I still had the file open. The Swordmaster is backed by Messiah Guild resources, he said. Not independently. He has been running joint operations under Adrian's umbrella for 14 months. I had assumed that. I said so. There is something else, Oscar said. He paused. Oscar did not pause often. He was the kind of man who edited himself before speaking so that pauses were not necessary. When he paused, it was because he had information he was deciding how to deliver, rather than whether to deliver. The weapon development project, he said. We flagged a reference in the communication fragments from Sam Oliver's devices. The Messiah Guild's research wing has an open commission, external sponsor. They are building a weapon specifically for use against the Dark World surrogate class. I did not say anything. It neutralizes skills on contact with the target, Oscar continued. All active skills, instant and complete on impact. They are calling it the neutralization weapon in internal documentation. It is in testing. It does not have a public name yet. A lance. I already knew the shape of it, even if he had not described it. The Spear of Longinus. I had heard the name once. In a fragment from the life I was trying to prevent from repeating. Adrian had always been methodical. A threat that could not be removed directly would be removed by building the correct tool. He had been building the correct tool the whole time. How far along is the testing? I asked. Unknown. The reference was a single line in a procurement authorization. We do not have access to the research wing's timeline. All right, I said. All right, he repeated. There was a question in it. It changes the timeline, I said. Not the direction. Add it to the file. I set the phone down and looked at the Swordmaster's vow on the screen in front of me. 2 threats on the board now. The Swordmaster was visible, public, predictable. The kind of threat I could track through normal channels and address when the timing was right. The weapon was different. The weapon was Adrian thinking 3 moves ahead, which was exactly what Adrian always did, and exactly what I had come back to interrupt. I had time. Not unlimited time, but enough to work with. I pulled up the Japan dungeon briefing Francis had forwarded. The A-rank Dragon Hatchling. 3 weeks. The next checkpoint on a list that was getting longer in both directions. More assets building in front of me. More pressure building behind. I started reading. The Cyclops dungeon in Norway took me 4 hours. I went in with the skeleton army, cleared floor by floor, and came out with a legendary eye that could generate lightning arcs across a 30-meter radius. The Lightning King, Henry, had been circling the dungeon's exterior with his guild roster for 2 days, waiting for a crack in the gate schedule. I walked past him on the way out with the eye already in my inventory. He called after me. Isaac Ivanov, he said. That eye belongs to whoever commissioned the gate access. I turned around. Henry had his guild behind him, 28 hunters, minimum, and 3 of them were holding equipment that was clearly Thunderbird guild grade. Not show gear, field gear, the kind you carry when you think you might actually need it. The gate was public access, I said. I registered first. Technicality. That is how ownership works. He stared at me for a moment. I could see him doing the math. His guild against mine. Except my guild was one woman eating a rice ball by the dungeon entrance, and an army of skeletons standing at interval behind me in the gate shadow. He knew what the army looked like. He had heard about Taiwan. He offered me a deal instead of a fight. The vampire legendary skill, a skill he had been holding as a recruitment tool for 6 months, in exchange for the Cyclops Eye and a loose loyalty arrangement with the Thunderbird Guild. I took it. Not because I needed his loyalty structure, but because the vampire skill had uses I was already calculating, and because handing Henry a win here cost me nothing except one legendary item I had not factored into any future plan. He walked away satisfied. I registered the Thunderbird Alliance with Oscar that evening. Oscar wrote it down in his second notebook, the one he kept for arrangements that were technically real and practically flexible. How loose is loose? Oscar asked. Loose enough that it does not constrain anything I am planning to do. He wrote that down too. The Sphinx dungeon in Egypt was a different caliber of problem entirely, and I had known Marcus would be there since I booked the gate. In the previous timeline, I had never entered the Sphinx dungeon. I had died before Egypt came fully into rotation. What I knew about it came from secondhand accounts. The creature was enormous, AAA rank, with a set of pre-combat riddles built into the encounter architecture that killed the hunter if answered wrong. The riddles were solvable. I had spent 2 months memorizing them before I registered this gate. What I had not known in those 2 months of preparation was that Marcus would arrive with a Hades ring. I found out when his first skeleton soldier turned mid-combat and raised a hand toward my formation. The Hades ring did not work on legendary grade skeleton soldiers with direct soul link contracts. It worked on the standard units, the 147-foot soldiers I had been running as a blocking wall across the dungeon's second chamber. Marcus's ring sent a mana pulse through them and they turned. I withdrew the special units immediately. Leona had already moved to a pillar on the right flank before I gave the signal. She read the ring the moment it activated, which confirmed she had encountered it before somewhere in her long and privately documented past. 47 seconds, with only the legendary units and Leona. The Sphinx closed the distance on Marcus's camp from the left, while I pulled its attention from the right with 3 corpse explosions in sequence. The second and third ones overlapping the shockwave of the first, creating a concussive channel that pushed the Sphinx's charge trajectory left. Then I used the Osiris ring. Victor had given me the Osiris ring the previous week as advance payment on a conversation he did not yet know he would be having. The ring granted a resurrect skill, 1 use per gate, cooldown of 24 hours. I had been holding it for something that required a flying approach. The Wyvern corpse was on the 3rd floor. I had passed it on the way up and noted it without breaking stride. I resurrected it, took the mount controls before the corpse had finished reconstituting, and drove it directly into the Sphinx's left flank at the moment it crossed into Marcus's camp perimeter. The collision was decisive. The Sphinx's momentum carried through Marcus's formation. When the dust settled, his necromancers were gone. His artifact support team was down. He had 2 people standing, himself, and 1 shield-class hunter, whose left arm was at the wrong angle. Marcus was standing in the middle of what had been his operational setup, and was now a large amount of cleared stone. He looked at me across the dungeon floor. I let the silence run for 3 seconds. The Hades ring was a reasonable play, I said. You could not have known I would route around it that way. No, he said. I could not. He reached up and took off the Hades helmet, the one he had taken off the Swordmaster's inventory access earlier that week, which Oscar had flagged in the intelligence feed as a sign Marcus was already burning his alliances. He set it on the ground between us. Then he removed the Hades ring from his right hand and placed it beside the helmet. I am not surrendering, he said. I am proposing terms. I waited. You will reach the final gate, Marcus said. I have watched what you do with information and resources, and I have run the calculation every way I know how to run it. The result does not change. You are going to be there at the end. He paused. I want to be there too, not watching, not as a neutral party, alongside. I asked him what he wanted for that. I want the class acknowledged, he said, not reclaimed. I understand the mechanics. The class transferred. The transfer was legitimate. It cannot reverse. I am not asking for the reversal. I am asking that when the record survives the end of this game, whatever form that survival takes, the acknowledgement exists somewhere that the Dark World surrogate class originated with me. Not erased, not anonymized. That I existed. He was watching my face while he said it. Not performing. Checking. The soul contract, he said. I will bind myself to your side through the final gate gate. Violation costs one of us catastrophically. You know what that means for a class that has as much to lose as mine does. It is not faith. It is a structure that does not require faith. I looked at the helmet and ring on the ground between us. I looked at Marcus. He was proud. He was also correct about the math, and he knew I was correct about the math, and we were both standing in a destroyed dungeon chamber on opposite sides of a calculation that had just reached the same answer. The acknowledgement stands, I said. The record will reflect it. He held out his hand. The soul contract formed between us, a cold light, brief, binding at a depth that made my inventory system register a new status flag. The contract locked. Whatever Marcus chose to do from this moment, it would not be against me. He picked up the helmet and ring from the ground and handed them to me properly. What do you want me to do first? He asked. Nothing yet, I said. Learn the Cyclops dungeon layout. I will send Oscar the briefing file. He nodded once. Leona had watched the entire negotiation from the right flank pillar without moving from where she had braced. As Marcus and his surviving hunter walked toward the dungeon exit, she dropped down from the pillar and walked over. She said, which from her was approximately a paragraph. Victor's office was on the 42nd floor of a building that had been commissioned before the gates opened and finished 2 years after, which meant it existed in the particular aesthetic of someone who had made plans during a simpler world and refused to revisit them. I arrived without announcing it in advance. His assistant tried to delay me at the lobby. I told her I would wait in the lobby until Victor came down, which would take longer and be visible to everyone who passed through, or Victor could see me in his office now. She made a call. I was upstairs in 4 minutes. Julia was in the office when I arrived. She was standing to Victor's right, slightly back, in the precise position she always occupied when Victor was meeting someone he expected to need managing. She looked at me when I walked in. I did not look away from her. She did not look away either. Victor was standing at the window. He turned when I entered and crossed to the center of the room rather than sitting, a position choice that was supposed to read as equal footing. I stood where I had stopped, near the door, and did not move to close the gap. The Phoenix Guild arrangement is over, I said. Victor's expression did not shift. He had spent 20 years reading rooms, and he was reading this one now. The arrangement has terms, he said. 6-month review cycles. The next cycle is in. The review cycle was designed for a situation where your guild provided meaningful operational coverage for Isaac Ivanov's activities, I said. That situation no longer exists. Your guild cannot field forces that would survive contact with my current operational capacity. The arrangement's leverage has a military basis. The military basis expired. He was quiet for a moment. You are not here to renegotiate, he said. No, I am here to give you a week to decide how the transition happens. I told him the structure. Phoenix Guild absorbed into a new organizational arrangement under my nominal leadership, publicly, with credit given to Victor for the contribution his guild had made in the early period. No humiliation, no debt recorded. The guild's civilian operations, real estate interests, and non-combat infrastructure continued under Phoenix Guild branding. Victor kept his title internally. What changed was the operational command layer, which would be mine. Victor said nothing for several seconds. He was not calculating whether to fight. He had already done that and arrived at the right answer before I walked in. He was deciding whether to perform reluctance or whether performing it would cost him in ways the performance was not worth. A week, he said. A week. I turned to leave. Behind me, I heard Julia set down whatever she had been holding, a tablet or a folder, the soft sound of someone putting something down precisely rather than dropping it. I did not turn around. The Swordmaster arrived at the convoy staging area outside the Japan gate on a Tuesday morning. Leona was eating. He had brought his full guild roster, 41 hunters, the 3 artifact specialists who had built his combat advantage over the previous 18 months, and a portable mana disruptor that Oscar had flagged in last week's intelligence summary as the Swordmaster's best answer to a skeleton army. The disruptor was mounted on a wheeled platform. Someone had painted the guild crest on the side, which I found inadvertently funny. The convoy staging area had 8 of my skeleton soldiers on perimeter, and Leona sitting on a supply crate eating from a container she had acquired from somewhere and not explained. The Swordmaster told her to step aside. She looked at him. She put the container down on the crate next to her. She stood up. What happened next was not long. The Swordmaster had a genuine sword technique, not a skill, an actual developed physical discipline built over 15 years of ranked dungeon combat. It was good. In any other context, I would have acknowledged it as good. He opened with the full extension version of it, the form that had ended 3 ranked battles in the previous 2 years. The one that the guild forums had spent considerable effort analyzing and concluding was unblockable from the standard defensive range. Leona was not standing in the standard defensive range when he committed to it. She had already moved. She came from behind his left shoulder at the moment his weight was fully committed forward. She did not use a weapon. She used her hands. Whatever she did to his hands in those 2 seconds, I was not watching directly. I was monitoring through the skeleton perimeter feeds. The result was that the Swordmaster dropped the sword. He did not drop it the way a person drops something from surprise. He dropped it because the functionality required to hold it was no longer accessible. The guild roster had not moved. 41 hunters standing in formation, the mana disruptor on its painted wheeled platform, none of them moving, because what they had just watched was their guild leader, a man who had beaten ranked hunters across 3 continents, fail to land a strike on a woman who had not fully stopped eating. The Swordmaster tried once more. He picked the sword up from the ground in both hands, turned, and drove toward me, not Leona. His last attempt was aimed at the principal, not the bodyguard. I respected the read. I raised the Aegis shield. The Aegis shield was indestructible. It absorbed the full force of the strike. The Swordmaster's hands, already damaged, could not hold the impact. The sword hit the ground again. He went to his knees. I looked at him for a moment. He was breathing hard. His guild had not moved. The mana disruptor was still on its wheeled platform. 41 people standing in the morning light, very quiet. Hunters get discarded when the game ends, the Swordmaster said. His voice was steady in the way of someone using will to hold it there. You understand that. The people who run this will clean up everything that was useful and then remove everything that knew too much. That includes you. That includes everyone who did what we did in those dungeons. I looked at him for a moment longer. He was right about the machinery of it. He was not wrong about what the world was doing to people who had been useful to it. He just had not known himself well enough to be useful for the right things. Be good in your next life, I said. I ended it cleanly. The guild stood in place for 11 seconds after. I counted, because the skeleton feed timestamp was running. Then the guildmaster's second walked to the mana disruptor, turned it off, and began directing the retreat. No words, no formal acknowledgement. The convoy staging area was quiet again by the time Leona sat back down and picked up the container. She ate in silence for a moment. He had good form, she said. He did. It did not help. No, I said. It did not. She finished eating. I read through the morning's inventory updates. Somewhere on the 42nd floor of a building designed for a simpler world, Victor was making his decision. Somewhere in a Norway debriefing room, Marcus was reading the Cyclops briefing file Oscar had sent. The pieces were in their places. The soul contract sat quiet in my status field, locked and patient, like something that had always been waiting for the math to resolve. I sent Oscar a message. The Swordmaster situation is closed. Update the obstacle list. He sent back an acknowledgement in 11 words, which was long for him. Francis also sent something, he added. A man came by the office this morning. Big blade. European. He left it with me and said it was for the collection. The Balmung sword. Francis had routed it through Oscar without explaining why he was not keeping it. I can kill the savior, the blade's description read, for the people who knew what savior meant in this context. I filed it in the back of the inventory. There was a long road between now and the moment that weapon became relevant. I was not in a hurry to reach it. Log it under long-term assets, I told Oscar. Done, he wrote back. Should I book coach or business for Egypt cleanup? Coach. Obviously, coach. Coach, I sent. He sent back a single character that I was fairly certain was not a word in any language. And then he sent the ticket confirmation. Julia's explicit moment had come 3 days before the Swordmaster, in the backseat of a car leaving the Cyclops dungeon area. Oscar had been in the front seat. She had waited until they were moving, and then she had turned and looked at him across the center console. She told him she already knew, about her father, about how he died, about who ordered it. Oscar did not say anything. She told him she was not okay. She said it without inflection, as a reported fact. Then she said that was exactly why she was not stopping. Oscar told me this the evening after it happened, in the same flat, efficient delivery he used for everything, except the moments when the information weighed enough that the delivery slowed down. This was one of those moments. She is not a variable that resolves quietly, he said. No, I agreed. She is useful now. She is a risk later. I thought about Julia standing to Victor's right in his office, setting down the tablet precisely, not looking away when I looked at her. She was building something. It was aimed at the same target mine was aimed at, from a different angle, with different tools, and for a reason that was entirely personal and entirely non-negotiable. Leave it, I said. Oscar paused. Leave it. She knows what she is doing. Let her do it. He wrote something in the second notebook. I did not ask what. Outside, the evening was doing what evenings do. new. I opened the Japan dungeon briefing on the next gate rotation. The dragon hatchling phase was behind us. Ahead of us were the B-rank cluster in Indonesia, the triple gate overlap in Morocco, and the particular problem that the Messiah Guild was starting to move in ways that Oscar's network was not yet fully mapping. The Swordmaster was off the list. Marcus was bound. Victor had a week. The architecture was clicking into place. I went to work. I had fought everything this dungeon sent at me for 2 floors without breaking a sweat. Henry was a different conversation. The first thing he did was separate me from my skeleton units. A single arc, 1 pulse of compressed lightning moving sideways across the stone floor, and 4 bone constructs dissolved before they could close the gap. Not damaged, dissolved. The charge traveled the mineral content in the bones and unraveled them from the inside out. I recalibrated fast. Standard formations were useless here. Marcus took the left flank without being told. That was the soul contract working in practice for the first time, not obedience. Something closer to professional instinct. He read the same field I was reading and moved to the position that made sense. His necromancer support held back Henry's scouts and bought me 30 feet of space on the right corridor. Leona held the rear entrance. She was not fighting yet. She was just standing there. That was somehow more frightening than if she had been doing something. Henry came through the left corridor junction at full speed, and I was out of position. The strike caught me on the left side before I finished the dodge. Not full contact, a grazing discharge rather than a direct hit, but a grazing discharge from Henry was still enough to throw me into the far wall and leave a scorched line across my ribs through the armor. I felt the burn before I felt the impact. I slid down the wall and sat there for 1 full second, taking stock. Alive. Armor cracked along the left panel, ribs intact. The pain was clean. No internal damage, just surface tissue and nerves firing. The vampire skill activated on its own. My body pulled from the ambient darkness and began repairing the burn. Slower than I wanted, but faster than nothing. Henry landed in the corridor and looked at me with an expression I had not seen on a hunter in a long time. Genuine assessment. He was not certain he had won. The hemotoxin, I said, mostly to myself. The blood mist was a calculated gamble. Lightning defense. Henry's core class ability was built to counter energy discharge, electrical, kinetic, thermal mana type attacks. It treated incoming threats as waveforms and nullified them before they landed. That was why my skeleton strikes dissolved. That was why direct mana type ranged attacks would have done nothing. Blood agent chemistry was not a waveform. I let the vampire skill push harder than I needed to for healing purposes. Let it oversaturate the air around me with the metabolic byproduct, the compound that the skill emitted as waste when it burned corruption into health. It smelled like copper and ozone, and something organic that had no clean name. Henry stepped into it. His lightning defense flared, treated the mist as a threat, found no mana signature to counter, kept flaring. The sustained output cost him concentration he could not spare. He pushed through anyway. Of course he did. We traded 3 exchanges in the junction. Him closing, me opening distance, him adjusting, me burning the vampire skill harder to keep the mist density up. He was faster than me. He was probably still stronger than me in a straight exchange. But the mist was inside his defense layer now, and every step he took through it accumulated in his respiratory system in a way his skill had no category for. The 4th exchange, he was half a second slower. The 5th exchange, he stopped mid-step to clear his vision. I put a bone javelin through his right shoulder, not a kill strike, a locking strike, and activated the full mist burst, a concentrated expulsion. The corridor went opaque white. When it cleared, Henry was on one knee. His breathing was controlled. His posture was disciplined even in defeat. He had one hand pressed to the shoulder wound, and he was looking at me with an expression that had moved past assessment into something more precise. I walked over and stood in front of him. The burn on my ribs was still speaking to me. I let it. "You pushed me harder than anyone else has this timeline," I said. That was not a compliment to make him feel better. It was a fact I was filing for later. Henry said nothing for a moment. Then he looked at the javelin in his shoulder and said, "You hit me on purpose in a non-lethal location." "Yes." "Why?" I pulled the javelin out myself while he sat on the bench. He did not make a sound. I told him what I told no one else in this phase of the plan. "The final gate closes," I said. "That is not a theory. That is a mechanical certainty. The dungeon system is moving toward an end state. Whoever holds the gate controls whether the world on the other side gets opened or sealed." Henry watched me. "Adrian plans to be the last man through," I said. "He is not planning to seal it. He is planning to use it. What comes through with him is not something the coalition can fight gate to gate after the fact. It needs to be stopped before the door opens." Silence. "You have been building Thunderbird Guild for 11 years, I said. You did not build it, so it becomes the second half of a losing coalition. Henry let out a slow breath. He looked at the ceiling. He looked at the wound in his shoulder, which was already beginning to close under his own healing skill. My people, he said. First tier, not absorbed subordinates. First tier, I said immediately. Equal footing in operations. Your guild structure remains intact under the coalition umbrella. Henry looked at me for a long moment. Then he turned toward the corridor entrance and called his lieutenant by name. The man appeared in the doorway within seconds. He had been just outside, waiting. Begin the transition paperwork, Henry said. Thunderbird to Savior. Full merger. First tier terms. The lieutenant looked at Henry, then at me, then at the javelin hole in Henry's shoulder, and then said simply, yes, sir. Henry turned back to me. The expression on his face was the expression of a man who had made a calculation he was satisfied with. I have one other requirement, he said. Name it. When the gate closes, he said, you tell me what actually happened, the full account, not the public version. I considered him for a moment. Deal, I said. There had been a photograph once, the two of them at a crosswalk, son behind them, both 17 years old. Julia had been standing on Stella's left. Stella had just told her she had awakened as a player. Her class confirmed, her future suddenly different from everyone else's. Julia had taken the photo on her phone, and they had both been laughing. Neither of them had known what it meant yet. Neither of them had known that the class Stella had awakened would eventually put her in rooms like this one. The photograph was torn in half now. Julia had torn it the day she confirmed the chain of documentation linking Stella's operational authorization to her father's death. She had kept the half with just herself. She did not know if she had done that on purpose. She set the document folder on the table between them and sat down across from Stella. Stella had not moved when Julia closed the door. She had not reached for the folder. She was sitting with her hands flat on the table and her expression as composed as it always was. The clinical neutrality that Julia had once mistaken for calm and now recognized as control. You can read it, Julia said, or we can skip that step. Stella glanced at the folder. Skip it. Julia walked through the chain. She did not rush. She had rehearsed this, not the words exactly, but the pace of it. The contact routed through 3 cutout layers. The authorization with Stella's operational signature. The timeline of events showing the gate breakout was not an accident. The name of the intermediary who had confirmed the order 2 years after the fact, not knowing Julia had been building a record since year 1. Stella listened. She did not interrupt. She did not deny. When Julia finished, the room was quiet. You came alone, Stella said. Yes, and this record is held in 3 locations, Julia said. None of them accessible to Messiah Guild's operational reach. Stella looked at her then, not with the clinical neutrality, but with something older, something that might have been recognition, if Stella was still capable of it. What do you want? Nothing you can give me right now, Julia said. She stood up. She picked up the folder. She left the copy, a single page, just the authorization signature, on the table. I wanted you to know that I know, Julia said. I wanted you to have to sit with that. She walked to the door. Stella's voice came from behind her, flat and even. You understand what you are starting. Julia's hand was on the door handle. She had known Stella when they were 17 years old. She had taken a photograph of her at a crosswalk on the day Stella's life changed. She had thought they would know each other for the rest of their lives. She had been right about that last part. I already started, Julia said. She opened the door and walked out. Stella sat at the table alone with the single page in front of her. She did not reach for it. The hall was full. Representatives from every guild in the emerging coalition. Thunderbird's senior officers in the front row. Phoenix Guild's administrative staff behind them. Independent operators who had reached out through Oscar's network, filling the rest of the floor. Leona was at the back near the exit. She was not interested in ceremony, but she showed up, which meant she thought it mattered. Marcus stood at my left shoulder. He was wearing the Hades helmet. From the outside, he was Isaac Ivanov, the face the coalition knew, the name the public documents used, the identity that had been the public version of this operation for months. That was about to stop. I had told Oscar the night before. He had looked at me for a long moment, set down his paper cup, and said, "You realize the entire logistics stack is organized under that name. Refile it," I said. He had thought about it and then said something I did not expect from him. About time. The room settled. The background conversations dropped to nothing. I stepped forward to the center of the floor. The Savior Guild is formally announced today, I said. Phoenix Guild and Thunderbird Guild are now operating under a unified structure. Combined assets, combined forces, coordinated command. I paused. The guild is registered under my name. I said. My name is Ethan, not Isaac, not Ivanov. Ethan. The name went out across the hall and landed in the specific silence that follows an unexpected answer to a question no one had known they were waiting to ask. Someone near the back said something quietly to the person next to them. In the front row, Henry's lieutenant wrote something in the margin of the document he was holding. I said it the same way I would say anything else. No declaration, no ceremony. I had been other names and other faces in this building, and in buildings like it for the better part of a year. I had done what needed to be done under a borrowed identity, because that was what the situation required. The situation no longer required it. The Guildmaster is on record, I said. The coalition has a name, and it has a command structure. That is what we are here to announce. Marcus was very still beside me. Oscar, from his position near the side wall with his second-hand briefcase and his twice-resoled shoes, was writing in his notebook. He did not look up, but the corner of his mouth was doing something. I let the weight of it sit for exactly as long as it needed to. Then I moved on to the operational brief. Adrian set the Savior Guild founding report on the desk. He read the Guildmaster's registered name a second time, because the first time he had thought it was a translation error. It was not a translation error. He turned to the window and stood there for a moment with his hands clasped behind his back, looking at the city lights, running through a sequence of information that had no business being connected and was now inescapably connected. Stella, he said, without turning, I need everything we have on a hunter named Ethan. Pre-dungeon era, background, family, class documentation, everything. She said, who is he? Adrian did not answer that. He reached for the second file on the desk, the Spear of Longinus development timeline, and wrote a single word in the margin, accelerate. Then he drafted a second communication by hand, brief and specific, a request for additional resources. He addressed it to the executioner of the Holy Light. The name appeared in the operational record for the first time. No title history, no file attached, just the name in Adrian's handwriting at the top of a resource request that Stella would route through channels she had been told not to ask questions about. Adrian sealed the envelope and set it on top of the Spear timeline. He had met Ethan once, in a place that no longer existed in any record, in a moment that had technically not happened yet in the history this world was currently living through. He did not explain this to Stella. He just needed everything they had. He needed it tonight. Victor arrived exactly when he said he would. He walked in with 6 members of the Phoenix Guild Council behind him, all in civilian clothes, none in armor. That told me everything I needed to know about the mood he was bringing. This was not a fight. This was a closing. The week I had given him was up. He had spent it doing the math, and the math did not change. I was standing at the far end of the hall when they came in. I did not move toward them. Victor crossed the floor himself, and the council fanned out behind him with the practiced stillness of people who have attended enough of these meetings to know their job is to be present and say nothing. He set the Phoenix Guild seal on the table between us, a flat hexagonal piece, bronze and worn at the edges from years of use. Whatever authority it represented had been real once. It was real enough now to transfer. Phoenix Guild registers as a subsidiary operational unit, he said. Funding structures, logistics chains, the dungeon clearance contracts, all transfer under Savior Guild's operational umbrella. Full documentation is in the legal packet. I picked up the seal. He did not look like a man who had been defeated. He looked like a man who had completed a calculation and was satisfied the result was correct. There was a difference. I had worked with defeated men. Victor was not one of them. Then he asked the one question I had been waiting for. Julia's position. He held my eye. I want it confirmed in the structure. He had no way of knowing what had happened between Julia and Stella during the transition chaos. He did not know about the conference room or the documentation or what Julia had extracted. He had simply looked at her in the days after and understood that something had shifted. He was reading the changed weight of a person who had picked up something heavy and decided to carry it. Director of Internal Operations, I said. Full access, independent reporting chain. She answers to the guild, not to any single officer. Something settled in Victor's expression. Not relief exactly. The quiet satisfaction of a man who had made one good call and was watching it pay off in a currency he had not expected. Julia was standing 3 meters to my right, hands folded in front of her, expression professionally neutral. She caught Victor's look and held it for exactly 1 second. Victor took a breath. Then he put one knee on the floor. The room had 7 witnesses. The camera in the northeast corner was recording. The Phoenix Guild Council did not move. He rose after 3 seconds, straightened his coat, and shook my hand. That was all it took. The UK dungeon was classified A+, 7 floors. 14 previous parties had attempted the full clear, and none had made it past floor 6. I pulled up the summary on the operations table. Leona was to my left, reading the floor-by-floor breakdown without expression. Marcus was standing at the back of the room with his arms crossed, already running his own numbers. Francis had his elbows on the table and his chin resting on one fist, looking at the floor 6 illustration the way a man looks at something he has spent years thinking about. The Messiah contingent is sending a representative, Oscar had confirmed the night before. Cho Sung-woo, mid-rank logistics and coordination, officially. I have him listed as something else in my notes. I had noted that and said nothing. 5 guilds had confirmed participation. Major clearance groups, legitimate clearance records, good equipment. They all thought they had a chance because I had made them think so. I had announced that I would attempt the dungeon without King Arthur's ring and without the Merlin staff. I could see why that looked like an opening. The entrance chamber smelled like old stone and salt. The dungeon was built into the bedrock below a London financial district building, the gate framed by reinforced concrete and calibration rigs. 5 guilds had assembled their teams in the staging area outside. Representatives from each guild had gathered at the registration desk when I laid out the bet formally. The prize was the Merlin staff. The condition was simple. Whichever party cleared floor 1 with the highest kill count and fastest time would receive it. I would compete under the same rules as everyone else, without the ring, without the staff. If any party outperformed my team on floor 1, the staff went to them. I watched the 5 delegation leaders sign the record sheet. Their confidence was almost friendly. These were competent people who had done their math. They had looked at the legendary items I was choosing not to use and concluded the gap was closable. It was not closable. I had spent 44,000 kills preparing something for this dungeon. The Death Knight skill page that Francois had passed through the French guild channel as a private trade had required that specific threshold to activate. The Skeleton Knight I had been running since level 60 had crossed that line 4 days ago in a private preparation dungeon that no one outside my team knew about. The floor 1 gates opened. I let the other parties go 30 seconds ahead. Then I sent the Death Knight through first. The Death Knight moved differently from the skeleton army, where the skeletons operated as a distributed force, pressing from all angles simultaneously. The Death Knight was singular pressure, a point of gravity that the floor's monster population could not recalibrate around. Chain of Death activated on contact. Everything the Death Knight touched either died immediately or entered a suppression state that the skeleton army converted into kills before the suppression lifted. The floor 1 population was dense, approximately 12,000 combat units across the full chamber network. By my calculation, the army cleared it in 47 minutes. The other parties were still working through their second chamber when my team reached the floor gate. Floor 1 cleared. All 12,000 units attributed to the skeleton army's kill count. The other parties combined had not matched a third of that number. I walked back through the cleared chambers to where the 5 delegation leaders were standing. They had stopped fighting. They were just watching. The bet official stepped forward with the ledger. I collected 5 guilds worth of legendary items. Galahad's shield came first, a broad kite design in polished pale steel, the surface cold against my fingers. I put it in inventory without looking at the rest until later. There would be time. Leona fell into step beside me as we walked to the floor 2 gate. Bored? She asked. A little, I said. Floors 2 through 5 fell in sequence. The dungeon's difficulty scaling assumed parties would arrive fatigued from floor 1. We were not fatigued. The skeleton army had taken all the attrition. My team had walked behind it. Floor 3 had a mass resurrection mechanic. Fallen enemies rebuilt themselves and rejoined the line if the original body was not destroyed within 30 seconds of death. The Lich handled that. Every corpse on the floor was converted before the resurrection window opened. The mechanic turned against its own function. Floor 4 was a silence zone, magic suppression for all active caster classes, not for necromancer undead, which operated on a different binding than standard caster output. The other guilds lost significant firepower on floor 4. I noticed it in the way they started spacing out between chambers, running cautious. Floor 5 was straightforward. I looked at the floor 6 gate and let the other parties rest for 20 minutes. Francis checked his equipment and said nothing. Leona sat on a stone block and cleaned the edge of one blade in short, precise strokes. The skeleton army waited in formation at the gate edge, completely still. Floor 6 is the Red Dragon, Francis said, without looking up from his armor clasp. Yes, I said. The dragon was enormous. I do not say that as an observation about scale. I say it because the word is the correct functional description of what standing 30 meters from a creature of that class actually felt like. The heat it threw was not fire. It was a pressurized thermal field. The way standing too close to a furnace door does not burn you, but makes the air feel wrong. 14 parties had died on this floor. Most of them had died to the fire. The previous timeline's data on this dungeon was partial. I knew the dragon's primary attack vector. I knew what had ended the parties before mine. I had spent 6 weeks preparing the specific countermeasure for that output, because the dragon's fire was not magic classified. It was a hemotoxin-laced biological combustion. The toxin was what made it unsurvivable. The fire was just the delivery method. I had the suppression compound for the toxin in the skeleton army's chemical unit. I deployed it on contact. The dragon hit the Death Knight with its first breath. The toxin suppression activated. The fire still burned, but the compound neutralized the hemotoxin component. The fire became heat and pressure without the secondary lethality. The Death Knight took the strike and held position. 3 hours. That was how long it took. The dragon exhausted its breath cycles. The Lich army worked the edges in rotation, drawing aggression without absorbing lethal strikes, bleeding the creature's endurance through accumulated minor damage, while the Death Knight held the center. The Chain of Death ability suppressed the dragon's ability to reset its thermal cycle. It could not recharge. By the 3rd hour, the dragon's wing membranes had stopped moving, and it was flat on the stone. Its chest still rose and fell. It was grounded. It was alive. Every other guild party on the floor had been watching from the tunnel entrances for the last 90 minutes. They had stopped trying to contribute. The math had made itself clear. They were waiting to see Ethan Park deliver the killing blow. I walked to the dragon's head. The dragon's eye tracked me. One black iris, the size of my torso, following my movement with the dull recognition of something that has lost and knows it. I raised my hand, not to strike. The conversion. It spread from my palm like cold fire, a wave of death-class mana that moved through the dragon's biology in a slow total transfer. The necromancer designation requires the target to be alive but unable to resist. The dragon met both conditions. The conversion ran its full cycle in 40 seconds. The dragon's chest stopped moving. The thermal output died. The red scales began to pale at the edges, draining toward gray and then toward white, then toward the particular translucence of bone that has never been exposed to air. The flesh condensed. The skeleton restructured itself around the new death class binding. The bone dragon rose. Not dramatically, not with a roar. It simply unfolded upward from the stone, each vertebra locking into place with a sound like heavy machinery engaging, the wing bones extending to their full span and holding. The skull oriented toward me. The jaw moved once, testing range of motion. Then it was still, waiting. Behind me, from the tunnel entrances, I heard the silence of 7 dozen people who had expected a killing blow and received something they did not have a name for. I turned and walked to the floor 7 gate. "Let's go," I said. The Dragon Knight was waiting at the center of the floor. It was a humanoid figure in layered plate armor, the design older than the dungeon itself, pre-industrial craftsmanship, the kind built when metallurgy was still an art form rather than an industry. It carried Excalibur in its right hand. The blade was glowing faintly, not with magic exactly, but with the specific light of an object that has been waiting in the same place for a very long time. Francis confirmed the classification from a distance. Stat reduction on contact with the sword. Any bearer who takes it without the qualifying ring loses 50% of all current stats, permanently until recalibration. The ring, I said. King Arthur's ring qualifies. It is the counter condition built into the Guardian's logic. The dungeon's creator put it there. A dragon slayer carrying the ring can take the sword without the penalty. He paused. I am here as functional confirmation of that procedure. The dungeon's structure reads my title. I nodded. The Black Dragon Guardian descended from the upper chamber as the Dragon Knight advanced. 2 objectives, 1 floor. This was why 14 parties had failed before floor 6. Those who had survived to 7 had not survived 7. The Bone Dragon took the Black Dragon. I will not describe that fight in detail. It was over quickly. The Bone Dragon was running on death class mana that had no ceiling, and the Black Dragon was a dungeon construct with hard limits. The floor shook twice, then the Black Dragon was gone. The Dragon Knight turned toward me. The Excalibur light sharpened. I pulled the Aegis shield from inventory and took the knight's first strike straight. The stat reduction hit the shield face, not me. King Arthur's ring absorbed the counterpressure in the same fraction of a second. My stats held. The knight was precise and fast. Every strike was clean, no wasted motion. The kind of combat discipline that comes from an entity that has been doing exactly one thing for a very long time. I matched it for 6 exchanges. On the 7th, the skeleton army closed from behind. The knight registered the encirclement and paused for 1 beat, a single moment of stillness that the Death Knight used. The Dragon Knight disintegrated, a clean dissolution starting at the extremities, the armor going first, the light in the sword fading from the tip toward the hilt. Then it was gone. Excalibur was on the floor. I picked it up with my ring hand. The grip settled with the specific weight of something that was expecting exactly that contact. A notification opened at the edge of my vision. Camelot Authority unlocked. All round table items in inventory. Power doubled. I ran through the math quickly. Odin's spear, Hermes' boots, Aegis shield, Galahad's shield from floor 1, the Merlin staff, the ring itself. 6 items, all round table class, all doubled simultaneously. I looked at the sword for a moment, then I put it in inventory and went to find the exit. Francis was the last one out after me. He had been quiet for the last hour in a specific way, not withdrawn, just running his own accounting. He fell into step beside me and spoke without preamble. "You know the Camelot lineage going back to the original dungeon source," he said. "What you just collected is the complete set. No one in this timeline has assembled all of them." "Yes," I said. He nodded once, slowly. The nod of a man confirming something he already knew but needed to say out loud to finish processing it. The staging area outside held the remains of the 5 guild teams we had cleared the dungeon alongside. Some of them were still at their equipment tables, not talking. The Messiah delegation was conspicuously arranged near the exit. 6 people in tactical formation. Cho Sung-woo standing slightly ahead of them, watching me come out. I noticed that Cho's hands were at his sides and not moving. I had noticed him watching since floor 3. I walked past the delegation without stopping. This part happened earlier, and I am telling it now because the order matters. Cho had made his move on floor 3. He had positioned himself behind the team during the floor 3 monster clearance. Standard logistic spacing. Nothing that would have registered as unusual to anyone watching the overall formation. The corridor was narrow. The lighting was low. The skeleton army was 40 meters ahead in the main chamber, working through the eastern wing. He had a paralysis class skill, targeted, fast activation, the kind that works on biological nervous systems, aimed at what he thought was the space between my shoulder blades. What he hit was a skeleton in a dark combat jacket. I had run body doubles since phase 2. The real positioning shift had happened the moment Oscar's report flagged Cho as an active reporting node. Marcus had identified the leak 3 weeks earlier and communicated it to me through a single line in a logistics update, the word sealed with an asterisk. My response had been to switch to a skeleton double in any compressed formation situation involving Messiah personnel. Cho's paralysis skill connected with the skeleton. The skeleton did not go down, it turned. Cho looked at it for approximately 1 second. Marcus came through a gate of hell from the wall to Cho's left. The gate opened and closed in 4 seconds. Marcus stepped back through and the corridor was quiet again. "Did you think taking out Isaac Ivanov would be easy?" Marcus said. He was not asking Cho. Cho could no longer hear anything. He was speaking to the general principal. Marcus sealed the record file and sent it to my operational channel. I read it on floor 4 during the floor's silence zone, in a context where no transmission could be intercepted. Cho had been feeding route information and timing schedules to Adrian's network for 11 weeks. The leak window covered 3 convoy routes and 1 facility address. Marcus had documented the full timeline. I changed the routes on floor 5. All 3 rerouted. The facility address was moved by morning. That was the complete account. Back at headquarters, Marcus handed me the physical file. It was a standard gray document folder, 3 centimeters thick. Index on the first page, timeline on the second, route map with the compromised segments highlighted in yellow on the third. No editorializing, just the data, organized for efficient use. The monitoring was through my own network, Marcus said. He never detected it. The Savior Guild internal channels were never involved, which is why the routes held as long as they did. He only had the information I let him think he was pulling. I went through the timeline without speaking. 11 weeks of compromised scheduling. The damage was contained and specific. 3 routes changed, 1 facility relocated. The remaining exposure is negligible, Marcus said. I identified the secondary contact in Adrian's chain before I closed the primary. That contact has been idle since day 1 of my monitoring. It was never activated. He was working alone. I closed the file. Anything else I should know? I said. The Bone Dragon will need a classification review with the Guild Association before you can use it in a registered dungeon clearance. He paused. I recommend we classify it before the week is out. Adrian will have heard about the UK dungeon within 48 hours. I nodded. He picked up his helmet from the table, tucked it under his arm, and left. The Bone Dragon was in the holding zone. The Excalibur was in inventory. Victor was inside the Coalition. Cho's leak was closed. Oscar had sent me a brief message that afternoon, after the UK clearance confirmation reached the public record. It said, Adrian is standing in an empty room counting the seats. I had passed the calculation myself in the previous timeline from the other side of that room. I knew what it felt like when the pieces started going. You counted the empty chairs. You ran the math on what each chair meant. You tried to find the gap in what remained. There was no gap. That was the point. Everything was in place. The final gate was the only thing left. I had been walking toward this for 2 years, not toward the gate, though the gate was the destination, not toward Adrian, though Adrian was the problem, toward the specific moment when everything I had built would go dark at once, and I would still have to be standing when it did. You plan for a thing long enough, it stops being a threat. It becomes a schedule. The dungeon was an A+ rated structure, 3 connected vault levels descending into a sealed chamber at the bottom. The kind of architecture they used to call unreachable. The kind of architecture that now had 2 guild armies moving through it at the same time, one on each side of the central corridor, both heading for the same door. Messiah Guild held the left passage. We held the right. The dungeon's design made this possible and also made it unavoidable. The gate at the bottom required collective guild presence to open. Someone had built that mechanic into the structure deliberately. You could not open the final door with a single guild. You needed multiple forces at threshold range simultaneously, which meant you could not reach the gate without the other guild, which meant you could not avoid the other guild, which meant that anyone who wanted to execute a plan at the gate had 6 floors of travel time to look cooperative. Adrian was very good at looking cooperative. We moved through the vault levels without contact, his people on the left, my people on the right, the dungeon monsters between us and ahead of us on both sides. I watched him from 40 meters whenever the passage opened wide enough. He walked the way he always walked, forward, certain, the particular posture of a man who had already decided how a situation ended. He was not nervous. He was not watching me back. He had already looked. Leona moved 2 steps behind and to my left. Francis held the right flank with his unit. Marcus was somewhere in the middle formation. I did not see him specifically, which was correct. The Hades helmet made him a noise signature I could feel in the ambient mana if I concentrated. A slight darkening in the air where a large man was not visible. Henry's Thunderbird unit ran the rear with the Phoenix Corps behind them. 50 skeleton soldiers spread across the formation. The Bone Dragon moved through the widest sections of the corridor, accommodating the ceiling clearance. The Death Knights held the forward flanks. I did not think about them as assets. You stop doing that after a while. They were just there, the way hands are there, functional, responsive, not requiring attention. 1 floor from the gate, I slowed the column. Not enough that Messiah noticed, just enough that the position spacing changed. My units were no longer clustered in a standard advance. They were spread in a pattern that did not look deliberate and was. Marcus would understand it. He had been reading my deployment geometry since Phase 2 of the London operation. He knew that when I widened the rear spread, I was transferring effective command of the rear units to him. He would not need me to explain. We reached the gate corridor at the same time. This is how the dungeon worked. Both passages converged at a single approach, 60 meters long, ending at a door that filled the entire far wall. Carved stone, old script around the edges, the kind of architecture that had been waiting down here since before either of us was born. Adrian looked at me from across the corridor. I looked back. He extended his hand. I shook it. The shake meant nothing. He knew it. I knew it. The assembled guilds behind us could interpret it however they needed to. It was a gesture for the historical record, a thing that would be described later, a data point for people who had not been in the room. His grip was firm and deliberate. His expression was what it always was, composed, certain, the face of a man satisfied with his own calculations. I kept my hand relaxed. We walked toward the gate together. He waited until we were 8 meters from the threshold. I felt it before I saw it, a shift in his body weight, the specific loading of a man who is about to commit to a directional movement he cannot take back. 2 years of watching Adrian. I knew the geometry of his attention. I knew when he had decided. The spear was in his hand and moving before I had completed the thought. White light. The lance was longer than it looked at rest. It always is. With the Longinus items, they carry a spatial distortion in the shaft that compresses the apparent length until the moment of deployment. It came through the gap between us fast and without ceremony. I had positioned a skeleton soldier 3 steps to my right. I dropped it into the path of the second strike, the one that would have taken my throat. The skeleton crumbled. Adrian had expected that. His expression did not change. The spear went through my left shoulder. The pain was secondary and processed later. What happened first and what happened instantly was the dark. Not visual dark, skill dark. 50 skeleton soldiers, gone. The Bone Dragon, gone. The Death Knights, gone. Every construct, every active undead, every maintained summoning, all of it inert in the same instant. Bones in the dirt. The enormous ribcage of the Bone Dragon collapsed across the rear of the formation with a sound like a building falling. And then there was just stone and silence where my army had been. My hemotoxin passive, offline. My undead command interface, offline. My spatial storage connection, severed. 1 second. That was all it took. I was standing at the gate threshold with a white lance through my shoulder and no skills, and Adrian 2 meters in front of me, watching. He said, "From today, Savior Guild will not exist anymore." His voice was disappointed. He had expected this to be more. I did not give him more. I did not fall. The spear was still in my shoulder. I could feel the weight of it. The Longinus items are heavy in a way that is not purely physical. They carry a specific gravity. The gravity of a thing that was made to end other things. It had ended my skill tree. It had not ended me. I met his eyes. He held my look for a moment, reading something in it, and then something behind the certainty in his expression shifted. Not doubt exactly, but the first suggestion of a question he had not accounted for. I had not fallen. He had expected me to fall. I was still thinking. He moved to the right, addressing his command unit. He had a 6-day window. The barrier would trap me in place. He would use the window. He was already moving to the next step. He was not wrong about the window. He was wrong about what I was doing inside it. Stella moved first. She stepped out from the Messiah command cluster and extended both hands, and the Bifrost barrier rose in a column of cold white light from a point behind me and closed around my position in a circle. Holy containment. The light was clean and surgical. Not a dramatic cage, just a wall of organized force that stopped exactly where it needed to stop and held. From inside it, I could see the rest of the corridor. The Messiah mage unit opened on the Savior Guild flank simultaneously. Coordinated, rehearsed, the plan rolling forward on schedule. Leona was already moving. She hit 2 of the mages before they completed their channeling. Her speed at close range was the kind that required you to recalibrate your sense of what a person could do. She was already behind the 3rd by the time the first 2 were down, and the 4th was adjusting his angle, and she was already past the adjustment. Victor stumbled backward from a mana burst that would have taken him in the chest. Leona absorbed the remainder with her left forearm, recovered without breaking stride, and Victor was still alive. The Archer Master was on the upper ledge of the gate corridor, a secondary gallery 15 meters up, built into the dungeon architecture. He opened with an explosive scatter shot that covered 40 degrees of the corridor floor. Leona read the spread, moved into the single gap in it, took 1 hit on the shoulder anyway, and did not acknowledge it. She pulled a sausage from her belt pouch without slowing down, ate it mid-stride, kept fighting. I watched this through the barrier and did not comment. The Archer Master's second volley was more targeted. He had recalibrated for Leona specifically. She absorbed 3 consecutive hits on her guard, the 3rd sending her back 2 steps. She ate another sausage. The look on her face was the same look she had for everything. Marcus was not visible. I could feel the faint displacement of the Hades helmet moving through the upper gallery, a density change in the ambient mana, a slight wrongness in the air at the Archer Master's position that indicated a very large man standing directly behind him. 1 strike. The Archer Master did not finish his 3rd volley. His apprentice, who had been positioned at the opposite end of the gallery, read the situation immediately and turned to run. Marcus was already behind her. It took 1 more second. Then the gallery was empty. Marcus dropped back into the corridor without ceremony and moved toward the Bifrost barrier's position. His chains of hell trailed behind him in slow arcs, the mana signature cold and settled, the particular quality of a man who has dealt with what needed dealing with and is now moving to the next requirement. The remaining Messiah mages began to break. Leona cut off the retreat path on the left. The Phoenix Corps and Henry's Thunderbird unit held the right. The corridor collapsed toward surrender in the methodical way it does when the tide turns past the point where continuing is rational. Stella had not retreated yet. She stood at the barrier's edge, watching it hold. She had not looked at me through the barrier once. Francis was fighting Stella's elite unit in the corridor section between the barrier and the gate approach. He had been in it since the opening exchange. Stella had deployed 6 specialists against him specifically, the kind of targeting that tells you someone did their research and took the opponent seriously. He had taken 2 swords. I saw it from inside the barrier. The first caught him across the right side, the second deeper on the same side a few seconds later. He did not stop. He pushed the first attacker back with his left hand and drove his elbow into the second's guard and kept his feet. He fought the way he always fought, not explosively, not with the kind of raw output that made people talk. He fought with the patience of someone who had learned his own limits very precisely and worked inside them. Every movement accounted for, every exchange calculated before it was committed. The Dragon Slayer title was not a power thing, it was a geometry thing. He understood exactly how much force was required and applied exactly that, and the gap between his exact output and everyone else's approximate output was wide enough to matter. The 6 specialists were down to 3 when Stella's barrier reached its full formation, and she stepped back to observe it. Francis stopped. He stood in the middle of the corridor, breathing carefully, not the breath of someone who is resting, the breath of someone who is running an assessment. His right side was bleeding through the tactical jacket. He had not acknowledged the wounds during the fight, and he was not acknowledging them now. He looked at the barrier. I watched him look at it. He already knew what the barrier's core structure was. He knew before we entered this dungeon. He had not told me because I would have spent the entire approach looking for an alternative path, and there was no alternative path. The barrier could only be broken by a sufficient concentrated expenditure at its structural core. Not a surface strike, the structural core, a specific point in the barrier's architecture 12 meters in from the nearest visible surface. The Dragon Slayer final technique was the only skill configuration in our coalition with the output profile to reach it and break it. He could not use it partially. The technique did not have a partial setting. You used it or you did not. He looked at the barrier for a few seconds more. He turned to Leona. Pull back. Not a question. Leona looked at him. She read the same thing I read. She had read it faster than I had, probably. She had known Francis longer than anyone else in the coalition, had run 6 dungeons with him before the war started. She pulled back. He walked to the barrier's structural core. His footsteps were even. The 2 swords were still in his side, and he walked past them the way you walk past a piece of furniture you've decided not to move. Noted, present, not relevant to the next 30 seconds. He placed both hands against the specific point in the barrier's surface that corresponded to the structural core. He looked up once, not at me, at the ceiling. Then he activated the Dragon Slayer's final technique at full output. The light went one direction, inward and down, along the barrier's foundational geometry, following the structural seam from surface to core. Not a burst, not an explosion, a sustained, directed, complete expenditure. Every unit of accumulated power he had carried through 3 years of dungeon titles, concentrated into a single terminal application. The barrier made a sound I have never heard anything else make, a sound that is less like breaking and more like a very large silence that has been holding for a long time, finally deciding to stop. It shattered. Stella was thrown back 16 meters. She hit the corridor wall, came off it at an angle, and did not stand. She was breathing. She was alive. Her elite unit scrambled toward her. She waved them off and let them carry her. She did not look back as they retreated down the left passage. The gate was open. Marcus was already moving. He reached Francis before Francis reached the floor. The chains of hell extended in a single practiced motion and caught him. Not dramatically, not with the kind of display that announces itself. They just stopped him from hitting stone. Francis was held there, suspended by chains that shone faintly at the contact points. His eyes were open. He was looking at the gate. The gate was open. He stayed long enough to see it. He knew the gate was open. Marcus held him and did not say anything, and I stood inside the barrier space that no longer existed, the spear still in my shoulder, my skill tree still dark, and I watched a man who had walked into this room knowing exactly what it would cost him confirm that the cost had been worth it. Then Francis was gone. The gate was open. Adrian stood at the threshold with the Messiah Guild behind him, looking at what remained of the corridor. I was still standing. His expression held its certainty. He looked at the spear in my shoulder. He looked at my face. He was reading the same question he had started to read a minute ago. Why is this man still calculating? And arriving at an answer he had not yet fully formed. The gate was open. Francis was gone. I was still thinking. The game was not over. The spear of Longinus was still in my shoulder. I looked down at it. White lance, longer than it had any right to be, protruding through the front and out the back. The wound silent because my body had already decided it was not going to do the obvious thing and shut down. The tip of it caught the dungeon light, faint glow. The weapon that had stripped everything from me, every skill, every summon, every dead soldier I had built over 3 years of dungeons, was currently sitting in my shoulder socket like it owned the real estate. I grabbed the shaft with both hands. I pulled. The pain was significant. I filed it. I held the spear in front of me and watched the blood run off the head. The wound in my shoulder was already closing. Not fully, not yet, but enough to tell me the bleeding was negotiable. What was not negotiating was the skill panel, still dark. every undead ability still locked. The spear's mechanic did not reverse just because I held it. I was not the bearer by the rules the weapon was built on. I would never be my own spear bearer. The lock stayed until I used it against someone else. The only thing I could do about the blood loss was drink someone else's. Leona stepped beside me without being asked. She pushed her sleeve back and offered her wrist. No ceremony, no commentary. The same calm she had operated with from the moment I met her. Not warmth exactly, but a specific kind of reliability that I had come to trust more than warmth. I bit down and drank. The vampire skill pulled the healing through fast. Whatever her constitution was, immortal, centuries deep, built from regenerations I would never fully understand. It transferred. The shoulder closed. The blood running down my back stopped. My skill panel lit up in full, every icon restoring in a cascade. I felt the way a man feels breath return after nearly drowning. The army stirred, 50 skeleton soldiers, rising from the stone floor where they had fallen 1 minute ago. Death Knights pulling themselves upright, still armed, still carrying the legendary items I had distributed before the gate opened. The bone dragon, inert for 60 seconds, straightened its neck and rolled its jaw and shook the stillness out of its frame. The Lich Mage atop its skull found its footing, its staff glowing again. The undead energy moved through the corridor like a tide reversing. Leona stepped back and made room. I looked at Adrian. He was standing at the gate threshold with his lance in hand, the Messiah Guild formation arrayed behind him, 300 hunters at his back. I had a broken army of 50 and 2 allies. Leona standing beside me, Marcus moving up on my right flank with the Death Class mana already thickening around his hands into the dark chains of his Gate of Hell skill. Adrian looked at the army rising and did not move. "You just keep getting up," he said. His voice was even, the voice of a man who was not afraid. "I'll give you that much." I had nothing to say to that. He activated Savior's Touch first. I watched the skill bloom across his frame, a faint golden light, the immunity effect locking into his stat layer. Every skill I had that reduced stats, suppressed attributes, poisoned or cursed or degraded. All of it just became decoration. The Excalibur aura I kept running was designed specifically to suppress hostile stats in range. It hit the Savior's Touch and stopped dead. Savior's Blessing came next. The damage resistance that skill generated was not measured in percentages any reasonable person would call manageable. 1000%. Attacks that should have opened him were going to land like suggestions. The Death Knights would need to hit him hundreds of times over to accumulate the kind of damage that actually mattered, and none of them had hundreds of strikes left before they fell apart. Last Judgment came last, the output multiplier, 10,000% damage boost on his attacks. One clean exchange, one lance thrust that found me, and the fight was over. I sent the Death Knights in as a screen. The first one closed the distance in 3 strides and brought its axe down in a strike that should have split the air. Adrian parried it and shoved the knight back 10 feet with the butt of his lance. The second knight came in from the flank with Mjolnir raised overhead. The hammer discharge lit up the corridor and pushed Adrian 2 steps left. He absorbed it. The third, carrying Odin's spear, thrust for his chest. Adrian deflected it with his gauntlet, and the knight's arm bent wrong. He was working hard. That was real. But he was working hard the way a man works hard at something he knows he is going to finish. I activated the Legend of King Arthur's hidden condition. Every round table item Ethan carried pulsed. Excalibur, the Aegis shield, the ring on my hand, the Balmong sword still in its scabbard. The power boost moved through the undead summons. Death Knights sharpened. The bone dragon swept in from above, jaw open, forcing Adrian to adjust his angle. He adjusted. I turned into bats, 40 of them, dispersing through the corridor, closing the distance from angles he was not focused on. I reformed behind him and bit down. Vampire skill. Blood poison applied directly to his neck. I pulled away and pushed blood mist into the air around him. Disorientation effect. I pulled the Solomon ring and pushed through it. 20 ant monsters materializing from the stone floor, mandibles first, surrounding his feet. He swung the executioner sword. The shockwave hit the ant monsters and dismantled every one of them in a single discharge. The explosion of force from it caught me before I could fully reform and sent me into the corridor wall. I hit stone. I pushed off it. Adrian was in front of me before I steadied. His hand closed around my skull. This was the exchange I had not wanted to take. He lifted me off the ground. The strength from Last Judgment coming through his grip was significant. The Aegis shield activated automatically, the defensive barrier absorbing enough to stop my skull from compressing. But the force still pressed, and his face was 4 inches from mine, and his expression was calm. "This is what you traded everything for?" he said. "Borrowed soldiers and a dead man's tricks?" I said nothing. I did not need to say anything. I needed to escape, and I needed the next 30 seconds to go the way I had planned them. I pushed through the bat dispersal again, 40 directions, the hand closing on nothing. I reformed across the corridor. I was running low. The Death Knights were down to 3. The skeleton soldiers had taken significant losses. Marcus was still moving on Adrian's left flank, the chains of hell winding around his forearms, the gate opening at his wrist like a wound in the air. "Don't," I said. He looked at me. "Do," he said. The chains of gate of hell launched across the corridor and wrapped Adrian from ankle to shoulder. Dark iron links, the death class binding that had held things larger than Adrian for long enough to matter. Adrian looked down at the chains. He looked at them the way a man looks at something inconvenient. He cut through them, all of them. The return force from the severed chains hit Marcus full across the chest and midsection. He went down. He hit the stone floor and did not get back up. His soul contract was fulfilled. He had fought through every gate. He had bought the second I needed. That was all it had to be. 2 sentences, Marcus. He fought. Then he was gone. I looked at what I had left. 1 skeleton soldier. No legendary items. No enhancement. Nothing attached to it. A standard unit. The most basic thing in my army. The kind of construct that dies to anything above F rank. A skeleton with a frame and a function and nothing else. And the spear of Longinus in my hand. Adrian stood at the gate threshold and watched me. He had been watching the skeleton soldier approach for 6 seconds. He had not moved. The skeleton was carrying the spear at shoulder height, walking at the pace skeletons walk when they are not being ordered to hurry. Deliberate, mechanical, covering ground. "You're sending a basic skeleton at me," Adrian said. He was not asking. "After everything," he continued. "After 3 years and all the items you collected, and the legendary dungeon, and the army, you're sending a basic skeleton with a lance." The skeleton reached him. Adrian had not moved because he did not consider it worth moving for. The skeleton drove the spear of Longinus into his midsection. The bearer paradox activated the instant the tip made contact. The spear's mechanics, built on the relationship between bearer and target, locked back onto the original bearer in the presence of a non-bearer, forced activation against a standing anchor point. The weapon recognized what it had been made to do and did it to the person it had first been used against. Savior's touch went dark. Savior's blessing collapsed. Last judgment expired. The golden light that had been holding Adrian's defensive stack together went out like a switch thrown. His stat layer dropped to baseline. Not injured, not weakened, just ordinary. A late 20s hunter with good fundamentals and no defensive skill currently running. He was standing at the gate threshold with a dead man's class bearer in front of him and me behind it. I drew the Balmung sword, the blade Francis had routed through Oscar's hands, the one carried from the brokerage table to the border and through every checkpoint to this corridor, designed to cut through any defense, any armor, any resistance the target could generate. I had carried it from Phase 7 forward, knowing what it was for. "Cheap tricks," Adrian said. His voice was still even, still composed. He watched me walk toward him, and he did not run. "You used a borrowed spear, a basic skeleton. You couldn't even finish it yourself." I kept walking. "No weapon breaks my armor," he said. "Nothing in this dungeon." The Balmung cut through his armor. The blade found the gap at his collar, and I did not stop it. Adrian fell. Then it was done. The undead army withdrew, not ordered, not commanded. The Death Knights simply stopped moving forward and turned back toward me, and the skeleton soldiers drew back into formation behind them, and the bone dragon folded its wings and settled at the far end of the corridor. The undead energy that had been pressing outward through the space pulled back like a tide. The Messiah Guild formation stood, 300 hunters, no longer anchored by the certainty that Adrian would close this fight. Their second in command, a man I did not know, had never dealt with, standing in the rank behind the empty space at the front, looked at his guild, looked at the formation, looked at Adrian's body on the ground at the gate threshold. He reached for the guild standard. He lowered it. Formal surrender. Weapons down, standard down. The specific silence of an organization that has just lost the one calculation everything else depended on. 300 hunters setting down weapons in a dungeon antechamber. The metallic sound of it settling, one after another, was the sound of an answer arriving. Messiah Guild surrendered. The formal processing happened in the antechamber behind the gate. I watched it from the far side of the room. Messiah Guild's leadership was being run through the accountability documentation, guild law protocols, the established process that existed for moments like this, administered by the people on my staff qualified to do it. Julia was at the table. Professional dark blazer, dark trousers, the clipboard she had been carrying since the moment I assigned her to this post, because she was the most qualified administrative person I had, and she had been waiting for this specific moment longer than anyone else in the room. They brought Stella in. She was wounded. Francis's final technique had done real damage, and she had retreated with it rather than stopped it. She was alive because she was too experienced to stay in a fight she could not win. And she was here because she was also too experienced to run in a way that led somewhere clean. She walked to the processing table under escort. The wound in her side was dressed but not healed. Her face was composed the way faces are composed when the composure is a decision rather than a natural state. She looked at Julia. Julia looked at Stella. Neither of them spoke. The processing continued. Forms recorded. Identifications logged. The formal machinery of accountability doing what it was built to do, quietly and without drama. I watched from across the room and said nothing. The Balmung sword was already put away. The room was full of things that needed to happen. They were happening. The gate did not close after Adrian fell. I noticed that when they were still moving the wounded out, healers moving fast, heads down, not looking at the body by the threshold. The surrender documentation was still being processed, and the gate at the far end of the antechamber was still open, its frame filled with that flat white light that had no source I could identify and no warmth. Whatever was on the other side of it had been watching this whole time. I looked at Leona. She was already looking at the gate. "You felt it too," I said. "Before you did," she said. We went through together. What was left of the coalition, Oscar's remaining unit, what the Thunderbird team had left standing, the healers who had already transitioned to combat mode because they were used to doing both, they came through behind us. The gate's collective presence requirement had triggered when the Messiah lines broke. It did not care about how many were left, only that the survivors were there. The chamber beyond was the kind of space that dungeons reserved for final things. Ceiling so high it disappeared, stone that had been worked by something patient and permanent. And at the far end, on a throne that had been shaped rather than built, a white-haired figure that did not move as we entered. It was not Adrian. Adrian had been the weapon pointed at us. This was the hand that held it. The executioner of the holy light sat with its arms on the rests and its eyes already on me, and I understood in the first 3 seconds that everything that had happened in 3 years of dungeons, every floor, every cleared gate, every name on the list, and the methods required to cross each one off had been visible from here, watched, assessed. The system that tracked class abilities and calculated death conditions and pinged notifications for completed quests had a source. We were standing in front of it. It did not acknowledge Adrian's death, not with grief, not with analysis, not with any expression that suggested Adrian had been anything other than a useful instrument that had stopped being useful. Its attention moved to me the way a problem pivots to its remaining variable. I drew the Balmung. I died 3 times in that chamber. The first time was fast. It crossed the distance before I had identified its movement pattern and hit me with something that the system registered as final damage, and my body agreed with. I felt the floor, felt the class condition activate, felt something that was not quite unconsciousness and not quite death, but was the liminal space the Dark World surrogate class was designed to occupy. Then I was back, full health. The coalition was still fighting. Nobody had noticed I had been gone. The second time I died, I had figured out that its projection body, the white-haired form on the throne, the one fighting us in the chamber, was not its actual location. It was a construct, a limited one. The real executioner was somewhere in the system infrastructure that ran this entire dungeon network, and this form was the arm it extended into physical space for exactly this kind of confrontation. The arm could take damage. The arm could be constrained. The arm could not be killed, because what you killed was only the arm. I came back the second time and told Leona what I had figured out. She said, "How do we make it feel that?" I said, "Annoy it until it overextends." She looked at me for 1 beat of silence. "That is your plan. It has worked before. It had not worked spectacularly before, but it was the plan we had." I rage baited the executioner of the holy light. I told it, loudly and in specific terms, that it hit like the weakest god I had ever personally offended, and I had a long list. I told it that the Korean divine hierarchy fought harder than this on a slow day. I told it that I had died twice to it and was still standing and talking, and that this said more about its limits than my luck. It sent me into a void. I will not describe the void in detail. There was no floor. There was no duration. The system broke in the space between the void and what came back. I saw the error code in the interface before the interface went dark entirely. A system exception that had no handler because nobody had written code for what happened when the death and return cycle hit a condition the void could not resolve. In the broken space between states, the emissary of the underworld appeared. He did not look pleased. He looked the way he always looked, like someone managing a portfolio that had become unexpectedly high maintenance. He pressed one hand to my chest where my heart should have been. What he placed there was not a heart exactly. It was more like a permission, a specific authority that said this body did not have to follow the Void's rules because it had already signed a different contract. He said, "Try not to die again tonight." I came back. The fight after that was different. The undying fighter arrived first. He arrived the way gods arrive, in the presence of something they oppose, not through a gate, not announced, simply present in a way he had not been a moment before. He took the executioner by the form's arm and held it, his grip carrying the authority of never-ending vitality, and the executioner's construct body could not move through that grip without effort it had not planned to spend. The silent hunter arrived next. She said nothing. That was, I understood, the point. And the agility she passed to me was less a skill activation and more a shift in my relationship to the space I occupied. I was faster than I had been in any dungeon, any floor, any fight in 3 years. I was faster than Adrian at his maximum stack. The listener of all creation arrived and gave me her authority, and I could hear the executioner's decision process before it executed each move. Half a second of advanced knowledge that in a fight at this speed was sufficient. The caretaker of the fountain of knowledge arrived last. She was the oldest feeling of them. Not old in the way Marcus was old, layered under years of specific work, but old in the way deep water is old, present in everything and not reducible to any particular form of it. She drew a magic circle on the floor of the chamber that the executioner's form could not step outside of. Then she turned to me and said nothing yet, because there was still something left to do. What followed was brief. The executioner's construct, stripped of its movement by the undying fighter's grip and the caretaker's circle, fighting inside the authority of 4 gods who had apparently been waiting for exactly this moment, did not last long. The Balmung cut through its projections in a way it had not cut through anything else, because the Balmung was built for things that thought their defenses were complete. The form collapsed. The white-haired figure on the throne was still, and then it was less than still, and then it was the shape of something that had run out of the power needed to maintain even an appearance. It asked for mercy. I had nothing to say to that. Not out of cruelty. I simply had no sentence prepared for it. The list in my head was empty. This was the last entry, and I had already made the crossing. I stepped back and looked at the assembled gods. "That's yours?" I said. They handled it. The caretaker of knowledge waited until it was done. Then she spoke. What she said was this: in the original timeline, I had died before reaching the final gate. Adrian had survived and controlled the world for decades after, not metaphorically, not as a cultural influence, as a literal administrative fact. The dungeons had not ended. The system had not stopped. Adrian had used both to build something that the gods had found, after several decades of watching it, impossible to correct from within the existing timeline. They had reversed time, not all of time, a specific window. The window required to place one person at the point of divergence, the point where, if that person made different choices than they had made in the original run, Adrian's outcome changed. The person they needed had 2 specific qualifications. They had to know how the system worked at a level that most players never reached, and they had to have a specific reason to spend everything they had reaching this gate. My reincarnation was not random. My second life was not accident or divine luck or a system error that happened to land on me. The gods had built the timeline around the one person who had both the knowledge and the grievance necessary to reach this point and not stop short of it. I stood there for a while after the caretaker finished. She had the patience of deep water and did not press. What I landed on, eventually, was this. The list still got crossed off. Every name on it, every outcome, every choice that had felt like mine. It was still mine. The fact that the conditions were created deliberately did not change what I had done inside them. The weapon had chosen how to swing itself. That was not nothing. Whether I was grateful or used, I decided, was a question for a different night, when I was not standing in a chamber with 5 gods and a coalition full of people who had fought for 3 years and deserved to stop. The caretaker raised her hand and revived the players who had died in the final chamber. Not everyone, the ones inside those walls only. The dying that had happened at the gate barrier and beyond it, and in every dungeon that had fed into this convergence, was permanent and stayed permanent. Francis was not revived. His death had happened elsewhere, in a corridor that belonged to a different geography than this chamber, and the caretaker's reach did not extend through closed gates. He stayed in the inventory. That was where he belonged now, fixed and known. The players who had died fighting the executioner woke up confused and asking questions that nobody had good answers to yet. The dungeon system processed the end condition. I watched it happen through the interface, the way you watch a building's lights go dark floor by floor. Not immediately, not all at once, but systematically. The game's infrastructure was designed to end. Whoever built it had anticipated this outcome and written the shutdown protocol into the architecture from the beginning. It was orderly in a way that felt deliberate rather than coincidental, the opposite of a crash. Every active dungeon worldwide closed. I felt the notification through the interface the same way I had felt every other system message for 3 years. A faint pressure behind the eyes. The system speaking in the register it used for class-level events. This one said, "Final condition met. System shutdown initiated." The interface went dark. My class indicator was gone. The skill panel was gone. The mana reading was gone. 3 years of overlaid information stripped clean in the same second, and what remained was just the chamber, just the people in it, just the physical weight of the things I was carrying. Guild registries suspended. Players across the world felt their classes deactivate. A decade of dungeons, of built infrastructure and trained habits, an identity built around a class and its skills, went quiet simultaneously. The game was over. What remained was everything built in response to it. The organizations, the alliances, the people who had restructured their lives around a system that no longer existed. Deciding what to do with that was going to take longer than a night. It was going to take years. That was not my problem to solve alone. I put the Balmung away. I put Excalibur away. I stood in the dark chamber with Leona next to me and waited for the rest of the coalition to understand that it was finished. 6 months later, Oscar came to me on a Tuesday with a folder that was not actually a folder. It was a printed record wrapped in a binding that someone had taken care with, the kind of care that signaled the contents mattered more than the container. "He's outside," Oscar said. Marcus was waiting in the corridor. He looked like himself, large, still, carrying weight that had nothing to do with equipment. He had been recovering for 4 months. He had not reached out during those 4 months. And I had not reached out either, because the soul contract had specified terms, and we had both met them, and there was nothing left in the contract that required contact. I gave him the binding. He read it standing in the corridor, right there, without sitting down or asking for a chair. He read every page, the class origin record, the formal documentation that the Dark World surrogate class had been designed for the Immortal King, that the assignment to me had been a system redirect in the original timeline's collapse, that his claim to the class architecture was prior and documented and now acknowledged. He finished reading. He closed the binding. He did not say anything. Not thank you, not finally, not any of the things I had imagined in the months the document was being compiled. He tucked it under his arm, nodded once, not at me specifically, at the general fact of the situation resolving, and walked his own direction down the corridor. I watched him go until he turned the corner. That was the end of us. Clean. No debts left on either side. The food budget discrepancy showed up in the second quarterly review. Oscar had the numbers in front of him when he called Leona in. 20 million won in food stipends, continuing at the same rate they had been running during active dungeon operations, despite the fact that the game had ended and Leona's class had, according to the deactivation registry, gone dark with everything else. Leona sat across from him and said nothing. She ate one of the pastries he kept on the desk for meetings and waited for him to continue. Oscar said, "Your food intake has not decreased," Leona said. "No, the system is offline. Your class is deactivated." "You'd think so," Leona said. Oscar stared at her for a long time. She ate the rest of the pastry. He asked her 3 more questions and received 3 more answers that confirmed nothing and denied nothing and left him in exactly the position he had started in. He called me afterward. I told him I thought it was a billing irregularity from the transition period and that these things sorted themselves out. He said, "She still has her powers, doesn't she?" I said, "I think the pastry budget is the more urgent question." He did not find this helpful. He spent the next 30 minutes making notes in the folder he kept for anomalies that had no clean resolution. Kim Woo-jun went into that folder alongside 3 other entries that Oscar had labeled, in his own handwriting, as things he was glad existed but would never fully understand. He was right on both counts. Stella came to Julia on a Wednesday morning outside the Pandora office building where Julia had taken a coordination role. She came alone and without notice and stood on the pavement 3 feet from the entrance with the particular stillness of someone who has rehearsed what they are going to say. So many times the rehearsal has worn grooves in the plan. She said that she could not accept Julia's forgiveness. She said her debts were specific and documented, and the accounting did not come out clean no matter how she ran it. She said she understood what forgiveness was supposed to do, and she did not think she had earned the precondition for it. Julia looked at her for a moment. Then she said, "I've done everything I can. You did most of the things you could do to address what happened. The only direction left is forward." Stella stood there with that for a few seconds. She nodded. She left. That was not absolution. Julia had not offered absolution, and Stella had not asked for it. It was just the sentence that was true, said to the person who needed to hear it said plainly, which was the only version of resolution available for some debts. I took Leona to dinner, a real one. Table, menu, waiter, the whole arrangement. No running. I sat down, and I ordered and I ate, and I paid the bill when it arrived, and I did not have to calculate an exit route at any point during the meal. She ate enough for 3 people, which was not unusual, and she was exactly as quiet as she always was, which was not uncomfortable. And somewhere between the first course and the dessert that she ordered for herself, and then ate half of mine as well, I understood that this was what the other side of it looked like. Not celebration, not the absence of cost, just this: a table, a meal, a person across from it who had decided to stay, the ordinary present tense of things still going. I paid the bill. We left. Final inventory. I started with a class nobody wanted, a skill set designed for a purpose the system considered shameful, and a list of names. The list is empty. I had allies. Some of them are gone. Francis is in the inventory, fixed and known. The weight of him carried forward exactly as he was when he stopped. Some of them are walking their own directions. Some of them are eating my dessert. I had skills. Most of them went dark with the system. Most of them. I had a second life that was not what I thought it was when I was living it. A reverse timeline, a deliberate weapon, a plan built around one person's specific combination of knowledge and grievance. That person was me. I have decided that what I did inside the plan was still mine. The weapon chose how to swing itself. I will carry that. What I know now that I did not know at the beginning. The ones who built the system that ran 3 years of my life hated it too. The gods who granted my class never wanted the executioner's project to reach completion. The thing that sponsored Adrian and watched everything from behind a gate was not the system's purpose. It was the system's corruption. The purpose was, apparently, something else. Something the caretaker knew and explained, and that I filed in the same place I file things that are too large to process in a single sitting. 6 months out, 243 players cleared from the guild registry in the final settlement. Messiah Guild's 300 members processed under the accountability protocols Oscar had written specifically for this, because Oscar had seen enough of how power worked to anticipate the documentation needs. Victor was still funding Pandora because Victor had been given a very clear explanation of the alternative, twice, and the second explanation had involved me not wearing the combat suit and the security team still not winning. The powers stayed. I never told anyone but Leona. Oscar suspects and will never get confirmation. The combat suit still fits. The knife still works. When a call comes in about ex-players being used as leverage for game weapons, I go and I handle it and I leave and the situation is resolved and nobody asks too many questions about the aura that radiates off me when the fight ends. I started this as the thing nobody wanted to be. I ended it as the thing that was needed. That is the whole story. Francis was in the inventory. So were the others who had been spent. The game was over. The list was empty. The bill was paid. I was still here. That was never guaranteed.